Okay, the County Board is now in session. The discussion and proceedings today are entirely with the board, so we appreciate you're all coming to watch us deliberate. That's kind of new, but thank you for being here. But we do ask that you allow us to have this conversation and not have any disruptions. Apologize for starting us a few minutes late. In this case, I valued caffeination over punctuality, and I'm not entirely sorry about that. So we are going to actually begin, colleagues, and in order to orient our discussion and make sure it proceeds in some semblance of order, I figure we can open it up to questions and discussion. We do have a number of members of the staff team that are here, and I do believe we also have a number of commissions that advise on this issue who are in attendance. I see the Housing Commission, the Transportation Commission. I know we have the Planning Commission participating virtually. And so we have a number of topic issue areas. I propose we go through them in order, and I'll just announce a couple of them so that you'll know what's following. First, allowed uses. And so this is the issue of how many units above 1, so anywhere from 2 to the permissible 6 per our advertisement. Anyone have any questions of staff or commissioners that they would like to raise at this point? All right, seeing none, we'll move next to minimum site area, and then we'll follow that with lot coverage. Minimum site area, these are the 2 series options. Number of them, I believe 5 in total. Any questions, Mr. DeFerranti?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm a little bit in a place where I feel like the phrase "show your math" is relevant, but I don't want to ask too many questions. So this may have been covered a little bit 2 months ago, and I'll just, it won't necessarily shock, but I think it is for Mr. Ladd. The staff report on page A13, it talks about, and you don't have to necessarily flip, it talks about rents of $2,700 to $3,300 and affordable ownership of $108,000 to $118,000. So we've had, in the course of the last couple months, and certainly over the weekend and yesterday, we've had a lot of questions about the consultant's report, and it was finished in April of last year based on numbers that I think were a little before that because data reporting. So it seems likely that, you know, the cost, because interest rates have gone up so much since then, the cost of a home under the 6 to 8 unit may have gone up, and the incomes that could be able to afford to buy and perhaps to rent might have increased. And so I wanted to first just ask, is that a fair assumption that probably both would have gone up? I'm not a housing finance expert, so and it may be that just ownership and rents have stayed relatively the same, but is it fair to guess that both those bands may have gone up a little bit?
So I think, and we did talk about this a little bit in January. You know, certainly the attainability, the income needed to attain housing is different than it was a year ago because interest rates have gone up. And as we discussed in January, interest rates, as we know, they fluctuate over time. This is a long-range plan. We're planning not just for the next year, and we're not going to predict where interest rates may go, but obviously when they're up, attainability goes down, and when interest rates are lower, attainability goes up. But in terms of the sales prices, you know, those are a year old, but interest rates don't have as great an effect on, you know, market sales prices as they do on the level of attainability and the income that would be required.
Great, thank you for bearing with me, and I won't have tons of questions, but just a couple follow-up and then done with this whole area. One is, based on what you said, we don't know exactly what the prices would be, exactly how much they would have gone up or if they even would have gone up because interest rates are, you know, some realtors are saying it's frozen parts of the market. Is that, it might have gone up, we don't know how much. Is that a fair
So I think, again, we're planning for the future, and we're not necessarily planning for what's going to happen in the next 12 months. The consultant's analysis was based on a point in time, and I think they give us a good order of magnitude level of what housing costs we would expect from different housing types under different assumptions.
Got it. And last, thank you for bearing with me because you gave substantially pieces that you'd already described. But the last question is, so the bulk of our consideration here is on 5 and 6 plexes. And it seems to me the reasoning would still apply that if you compared a 5 and 6 plex cost to the cost of a replacing single-family home, we certainly would have lower costs there. We've heard some people describing how an older home replaced by a duplex, both sides of the duplex could end up being more costly. Are those, I don't know if the consultant covered that. Is that a fair way to try to describe it?
So I think the equity analysis covers that a little better, and I don't have the figures off the top of my head, and we did, there's tables in here by zip code of basically what are current market prices for housing. And obviously it ranges by zip code, but in general, the median price for a house, not a new house, but just any house in Arlington, a single detached house, is roughly $1 million today. And so to the extent that if you look at the prices for missing middle housing on page A13 that are here, there's obviously a range, with the 6 plexes being lowest and certainly much less than $1 million. And then at the higher end of that range, semi-detached, right, a side-by-side unit might be more than $1 million. But it also would be new construction, so we would expect it to be more expensive than a 60-year-old house.
Great, and I promise last question, Mr. Chair, is since the January advertisement, the way I think I read it is that the equity analysis as well as we haven't updated significantly the equity analysis. It was where it was in January, and that reasoning would still apply. And then similarly on the consultant, we may not have, we had the April report. I'm not aware of whether we had a lot of back and forth over the last 3 or 4 months with the consultant either. We got the analysis, staff used it in reaching its recommendation, and the analysis should still be good irrespective of whether there's been 2, 4, 6 months or a year that has come between it. Is that fair?
Right. We haven't updated the housing costs in the last year.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's plenty of questions for me.
Okay, Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're debating options 2, right? So
Yep.
I have a question about our general approach and how we deal with non-conforming lots in different R zones. So what is our general philosophy about that? Specifically, I can tell you that I was studying option 2D, and that's line 120, page 57. So the penultimate line says that, for example, 5 or 6 dwelling units are subject to following minimum area requirements, 6,000 square feet, which basically says it's the minimum lot area of R6, and we consider that like the bottom, right? So is that any specific methodology behind that, or is it just the smallest R, the smaller R?
So the way, in the various option 2 series, the way that we have thought about non-conforming lots, and just for everyone's benefit, a lot is legally non-conforming if it was created prior to 1950. But it's non-conforming because it doesn't meet the the square footage requirements for the lot area or the width requirements. And we do have, because a lot of lots in Arlington were platted prior to 1950, we have, on the order of magnitude, maybe 19 to 20% of lots within Arlington are are non-conforming. So the way that the zoning ordinance currently treats one-family dwellings is if you're on a non-conforming lot, and because it's about 20% of the lots in Arlington, you're allowed to continue to build a one-family house on that lot. You have to meet all of the zoning requirements, setbacks, lot coverage, height, and everything there. So the approach that we've taken in the option 2 series is for the 2 to 4 unit dwellings is basically treat them the same as a single detached house. If it's a legally non-conforming lot, you can build 2 to 4 dwellings. And then for 5 to 6 units, it varies based on each of the options as if there's an additional minimum site area requirement, even for conforming lots on top of that. And so you raised option 2D as an example. So for 2D, you would need 6,000 square feet on an R5 lot, even a conforming R5 lot, in order to be able to build 5 or 6 units. And so we took that same approach for non-conforming lots. You would also need, even if you were legally non-conforming, you would need 6,000 square feet to build 5 or 6.
Okay, thank you.
If I could continue in that regard, so understanding that's what that is, what is the planning basis that you could encapsulate as to why that would be desirable?
Why it's desirable to allow development on non-conforming lots, or why it's desirable
Why the tiering?
to tier? I think that's a broader question of why are we tiering within the option 2 series? Why are we setting for R5? Well, why does option 2D require a higher minimum site area for R5 for 5 and 6 dwelling units? That was direction that we were given by the board to come back with options that provide for higher minimum site area requirements for higher number of units. And so we took that and applied that same premise to the non-conforming lots as well as the conforming lots.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal.
Question largely under the same headline, although somewhat unrelated. The question of perhaps bridging actually to forms into the 1 series as well. The question of comparators and context. The question's been raised a couple times. I think we last discussed this, I'm going to say last July, at our work session about why consider the level of density that was initially proposed with regard to the 8-plexes and is now on the table with regard to the 6, when peer jurisdictions have considered at lower levels of density. My understanding that Portland, for example, has a minimum lot size of something like 1,500 square feet. But could you talk a little bit about what we have for comparators, whether Arlington's lot sizes, even our smaller lots, are sort of industry average for mid-sized suburbs of our size, smaller, larger, et cetera, to help us get some of that context?
Yes, I have some notes on this, and it might take me a little while to pull them up, so maybe we could come back to that. But I do recall we had this discussion in July about Portland specifically, and Portland. I don't think it was 1,500 square feet, but it might have been 2,500 square feet was their smallest lot size. So yes, in general, other places that have adopted missing middle zoning reforms don't necessarily apply to, they don't necessarily have the same R5, R6, R8, R10 that we do here in Arlington. And they may have much smaller lot sizes than we do. And so the effective density on a site might be equivalent. For example, a 4-plex on 2,500 square foot lot is the same level of density in terms of dwelling units per acre as an 8-plex on a 5,000 square foot lot.
Really helpful, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeFranti, please.
I have one more, sort of a 2-part question that, in the interest of not having as many questions when we go through amendments. You guys, a couple of questions. You did an analysis of what other parts of the country have done that was brief, is that right? Portland, we just talked about, many other locations. Did we do a rudimentary analysis of other places, or I think JFAC did one as well? It doesn't have to be extensive. I'm just curious to understand a little bit whether you did we did an analysis of other jurisdictions.
Yes, so we did start, then this is, as we mentioned on Saturday, this is a process that we've started since 2019, 2020. So we're 3 years into this. Early on in the research process, staff did do a sort of best practices analysis of what other jurisdictions have done. As you mentioned, JFAC also looked at other communities and provided a report to the board. This is an area where things are changing so rapidly, and it seems like every month there's another jurisdiction that has done a significant zoning reform. We just can't keep up with what everyone is doing. There's a lot out there. We know that Victoria, British Columbia is allowing sixplexes on all lots, and so there's just a lot out there, and in trying to keep up with our work here in Arlington, we can't keep up with what every jurisdiction's doing.
So, see if I got this thinking right, and it may be, you don't have to answer if it's overly into a question of opinion. Whether or not, I believe that no other place in the country has done 6 by right except Portland. But that shouldn't be our determiner of what we do, because we should be pursuing the best policies. Is that a fair description?
Yes, and I think in looking, and again, going back to our process, we started in phase 1 with engaging the community on what their priorities and concerns are. We've talked about that a lot. The top priority is housing costs. And so when we went into phase 2 and the detailed study and the economic analysis, it was really what housing types would be necessary to reduce housing costs to a level that they could be attainable to a larger portion of the population. And so our recommendations for the RTA and all coming throughout here in phase 2 have been based on that, being responsive to that priority from phase 1. Sure.
That's very helpful. I try to think what's the right policy, but it is salient for me, Houston has no zoning, so you can build a huge apartment story building right next to a single family, smaller home. And so it's both what other people have done is relevant, but not dispositive as to what I will be ready to support. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you. I think we've concluded at least this initial round of questions on 2. We're going to now move to the 4 series, which is lot coverage, followed by permit limits, the 7 series. So lot coverage 4 series, Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to ask for a clarification on option 4B, that's line 153 in page 60, and that's mostly for our county attorney. Oh, yes, I'm sorry about that. Now it's better, right? So.
If you all need any accommodations, please address those to the clerk and try not to interrupt the meeting. We'd appreciate it.
Mr. Chair, I think the best accommodation is for me to speak in the microphone, so that's a fair request. So on option 4B, the text is about lot coverage, and it says that the 5% of lot coverage, additional lot coverage, typically, available to single-family homes for a detached garage. The proposal here is to make that available as a part of the base lot coverage of an EHO building. And the way I understand that, this means that this can be part of the actually built part, so habitable part, or it can be something else like parking. Is that the correct interpretation?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. I have found it helpful to talk with staff about better understanding the genesis of the exemption for lot coverage for a detached garage for single-family dwellings or one-family dwellings, the sort of history of that allowance, where it comes from. And if you could help us envision the type of garage that might allow for that scenario, and to the extent that was related to why this came forward as a zoning ordinance amendment at all. Sort of understanding what this means for one-family dwellings, I found helpful understanding what it could mean or not for multifamily or missing middle forms.
Right, so the rear detached garage, the additional 5%, this dates back to the last major overhaul of lot coverage in 2005. And our understanding was at the time there were, well, first of all, there are two allowances. One is for a front porch and the other is for a rear detached garage. And this was really trying to encourage, incentivize a certain type of one-family home design that had a porch, which I think we can all understand why, having a porch in a neighborhood context is desirable. And then the rear detached garage was more about discouraging having a garage that's attached in the front that takes up a lot of most of the facade. And so pushing that garage to the rear of the property, in order to do that, since we don't have very many alleys in Arlington, you'd need a much longer driveway to access the rear of the garage. The driveways count as lot coverage. So not only do you have this separate building that needs to be deep in the rear of the property that counts as lot coverage, you also have the driveway that needs to get you there. And so I think that was the rationale at the time, was really about discouraging those front garages. For EHO, we have other standards for parking that are proposed in the zoning ordinance that would limit the width of a front garage, that would limit the number of spaces that could be in a front yard. That there's a lot of text that dictates where parking can be built in the same vein as trying to create an attractive place, trying to mitigate, some of the worst designs that you could envision. But in thinking about a rear detached garage, when we're talking about more units, there's going to be more parking on site. We have already accommodated for that in the standards. I don't know that it's necessarily reasonable to expect if there's going to be 4 or 5 or 6 parking spaces to have a garage in the rear that can accommodate that many. That wasn't really the intent of the allowance that's currently in lot coverage. So there are other ways that parking can be addressed on a site, either within a garage or parked in the rear on a parking pad. And so the thought behind 4B is, let's allow for those other things to happen, either within the building to allow for additional housing, or if additional parking is needed, to accommodate that.
Excellent. So that's really helpful. And I think it's also clear from the sort of various renderings and mock-ups that you all worked on that it's never impossible for some sort of configuration to come forward, but it seems like it would be very unlikely for an EHO, particularly a small multiplex, to take advantage of the lot coverage in exchange for a rear detached garage. It's just going to be it would be very difficult for them to meet their parking requirements with that mode.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I explore that a little bit? Can you just explain more why you believe that that's true?
Well, just in terms of, as I was just referencing, to be able to, it's basically, you could have a parking pad in the rear of a driveway that could accommodate 3 or 4 cars. You could build a garage around those cars, and that's, that if option 4A is what is ultimately adopted, that may be what's seen. But also, the other consideration is there's no requirement for all of the cars to be within that garage under the current requirement. So you could see a scenario where someone just builds a 1-car garage in order to get that extra 5%, meets the requirement, but maybe there are 4 or 5 parking spaces on the property, and then they find another way for the other cars to be parked on the property.
And that scenario that you mentioned is also possible today with existing single-family home development?
Yes.
Thank you. Any other questions about the 4 series? Okay, let's move on to the 7 series, and then we will get into the areas that were a part of the manager's recommendation, beginning with the GLUP amendment. So 7 series, this is permit caps. Questions? Mr. Karantonis.
I can start, Mr. Chair. I have a couple of questions. In the case that this board decides to impose a cap on the permits, so the annual limit of permits, question number one, when does the clock begin to count? So is that the first day of enactment or the first permit that is ever granted, issued, or is it a different time?
The clock in terms of, maybe you could clarify the question.
So for example, if we say that we have a 3-year cap for 3 years with a sunset clause after 3 years, when does this start? So when is the first day of the first year?
So the proposed effective date for the zoning ordinance would be July 1st of this year. And so the way it's written in the text is it's based on a calendar year. So we would only have 6 months in 2023. But if the board were to, let's say the board were to adopt a cap, a 3-year cap, just as an example, right? 2023 would be the first year. 2024 would be the second year. 2025 would be the third year. And then in 2026, there would be no cap. Does that answer the question?
It does. So effectively, a 3-year cap would be effectively a 2-year, a 2.5 year.
2.5 year cap.
Or a 5-year cap would be effectively a 4.5 year cap.
Right, because the first year is going to be whatever happens in 6 months, and I think we could expect that, it's going to be new. I'm not expecting that there's going to be a rush of applications because it's new and because the development community and homeowners are just going to be learning what the rules are. So we may not see a whole lot in calendar year 2023.
Okay. And then the follow-up question to that is, when does a project count towards the cap? The moment that it is somehow officially submitted, what is exactly the moment that it lined up in the pipeline to count?
So I think our intent, if the board does adopt a cap, would be to base it on approvals, not submissions. Exactly how this is administered, I think, is something that first we need to see what the board adopts, and then we'll have to work out administratively how that gets administered and whether it's based on there will be a zoning permit, there will also be building permits. At which point in that process is the appropriate time is something that isn't in the zoning text and is something that we would have to work out once we know what zoning text is adopted.
I understand. Thank you.
Ms. Crystal.
To follow up on exactly that question, partially a question for our attorney, and then Mr. Ladd, if there's anything else you'd like to add from the staff perspective, a drafting question, so to speak. So if you were to look at, for example, option C, which is appended with an editorial note regarding the method of distribution, wanted to confirm that editorial note will cease to exist. Is that correct once any adoption of the ordinance is complete?
Yes, it has no legal effect. It's just there to give context.
To guide us. Excellent. Okay. So the assumption would be that anything the board does not specify with regard to the distribution of the permits is delegated to the manager and staff.
The implementation details would be delegated just in the same way the implementation details for any other permit in the zoning ordinance would be.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up. Because that doesn't mean, Ms. Kaur, that if we do not specify some sort of dispersion formula, that the manager could decide to do one, does it? In other words, if we don't specify, we could have all of them in one particular area. I mean, but if the manager or somebody thought that, that's not a good idea, and it's a better idea to kind of spread things out, limit it in one particular area. But I assume that the board has to specify that. The manager doesn't decide that, or am I confused.
If there's no method of distribution specified in the ordinance, then staff will have to figure out a rational way of implementing it and dispersing it, for example, first come, first serve. But they would not be able to enforce an arbitrary or substantive requirement without board action.
In other words, and that means if they had decided, because I know we have some proposals out for distribution, if that fails, they couldn't decide to use that then. They would still have to just, unless we specify it goes in something, they couldn't justify, we can only have so many in R20s or so many in R5 or R5s. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. We really do need to specify that if we want to make sure there's some dispersion.
If you want a hard cap based on district or some other characteristic, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about permit limits, caps, sunsets? Okay. Moving to the areas that did receive a manager's recommendation, there is an amendment to the general land use plan, even though it hasn't gotten a lot of conversation and attention, but are there any questions about that?
Mr. Manager, if I may, I would love to take the opportunity to commend that GLUP amendment to everyone's attention. I think it is incredibly well done. And for those who are interested in questions about, for example, how Arlington comprehensively plans for growth, how our general land use plan integrates with other elements of our comprehensive plan to address things like stormwater capacity or need for infrastructure like fire stations or wastewater treatment facilities. I think that really is worth a read, and I commend staff for the hard work that went into it, which I imagine brought in other departments as well.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Actually, just a question. It's contained in the text, but I want to make sure it's elevated as part of the public conversation. In your analysis for what might be possible under missing middle, the areas of our county that are currently glupped as low density would retain an average density according to your build-out scenarios that would still be a low density area of less than 10 units per acre. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. If you look at it at a larger area than
Right.
just an individual site.
Right. An individual parcel may vary, but the areas in which this would happen would still remain low density. So in terms of changing the broad application of the general land use plan, this is not intending to change that.
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. DeFerranti.
I'll say this briefly. I may touch on it in my concluding thoughts, but there are a couple of speakers on Saturday who referenced the general land use plan, and we're actually amending it today. So it made me think as though, highlighting it as you and Ms. Crystal have just done is useful because there was language that was one approach, and today we are taking a step to refine and change that approach. And so I just thought I'd say that much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, next on our list, I believe, is parking, the 5 series, and then we'll follow that with landscaping and trees, the 6 series. Mr. DeFerranti.
Don't need always to be first, but I do have a couple of
Your
questions.
light goes on first. It's you, my friend.
Got it. The Transportation Commission shared thoughts on I spent a fair bit of time with the Transit Master Transportation Plan. And so I have questions on 2 different parts. One is the distance from Metro, which is a half versus 3/4 of a mile from, and that's from a Metro rail station. And the other is on primary transit networks. The PES study says it uses half a mile from Metro, and our transportation plan is based on 3/4 of a mile. And I wondered if you had any thoughts. It seems to me that would just mean perhaps some of the estimates as to affordability might be a little shifted based on that incongruity. We had a Civic Association president mention this, and I wondered, it's page 4 of the PES and page 21 of the staff report. So.
Yes, so the PES study, again, is an economic feasibility analysis. And based on their methodology of economics, they used a half mile as the breaking point for where prices, housing costs would likely be higher, based on their knowledge of the market. And so it wasn't based on walkability or any transportation metrics. It was based on economic housing cost metrics of land in Arlington that's within half a mile of metro stations has, generally a higher price than land that is greater than a half mile. And so the staff report addresses from a transportation perspective why staff is recommending the transit proximities of 3/4 of a mile from metro, half mile from premium transit, 1/4 mile from the primary transit network.
Got it. And so I've talked with, it's very helpful to talk with our transportation staff and also to talk with other experts as well about, my impression now is essentially that the standard has been a half mile for how long people are willing to walk, at least certainly a decade or 2 decades ago. And it may be shifting. I sort of did a half hour's worth of searches just to see in addition. But that seems to me the standard, and our 3/4 of a mile seems to me about the aspiration for how much we would like for people to be willing to walk. Maybe I've overstated it, but somewhere between, that's kind of the question is there, are you guys aware of research as to what has been, or is it already the case that you'd say national research says 3/4 of a mile is the standard?
I don't think there isn't a national standard there, and so we look to the data that we have here in Arlington. And so again, in the staff report, we reference vehicle ownership rates within those various proximities from transit, and we see that I think it was 20% of households living within 3/4 of a mile of a metro station in Arlington don't own a vehicle, and we had other rates for the other transit proximate areas. We've also looked at our sidewalk network and how complete is the sidewalk network within a half mile of the metro stations within Arlington. We have 93% complete sidewalks, meaning that there's a complete sidewalk at least on one side of a street segment. And that does reduce slightly when you get to the next band between a half mile and 3/4 mile. It's 87%, but it's still very high and almost nearly complete. And so we look at that. We look at areas where people are currently living without a vehicle, currently getting to metro, and particularly with regard to metro, the staff report talks about it's not just distance to metro, it's that our metro are amenity hubs. Our metro stations are amenity hubs. And if you live within 3/4 of a mile of a metro station, you have access to commercial, just basically daily needs and everything that radiates from our metro stations, which makes you less reliant on a car. And we do have DES staff available on the call. I don't know if they want to add anything to that or if you have any additional questions.
Sure. For the record, my name is Angie De La Barrera with DES Transportation Planning. And I would just add to Matt's point is we looked at other research done. For example, the Federal Highway has done an analysis called the Pedestrian Safety Guide for Transit Agencies, and it states that most people are willing to walk for 5 to 10 minutes or approximately 1/4 to half a mile to a transit stop. However, recent research has shown that people might be willing to walk considerably longer distances when accessing heavy rail services. Therefore, in order to encourage transit usage, safe and convenient pedestrian facilities should be provided within the 1.5 mile to transit and greater distances to rail stations. Also, I want to point out that in keeping up with the region, the Transportation Planning Board, endorsed by the Metro Washington Council of Government, has this transportation plan called Visualize 2045, in which it seeks to improve walking and biking access to transit. And as Matt was pointing out, our MTP, the county's robust investment throughout the years has provided a network of sidewalks, bus routes, and bike lanes that reduces the need to drive. We see this in our multifamily development near transit, where there's a reduction in car ownership, and residents tend to use transit and other forms of transportation beyond just owning a vehicle. And I hope that answers the question.
Sure, thank you both. I appreciate it. We have, I guess, we haven't done a survey within Arlington to know what, whether a half or 3/4 of a mile, what people are willing. I've looked at the surveys, and maybe we have, and I just missed it. But have we done a survey on how far, other than the 20 and the 22% in that table in the staff report, have we done a survey of how far people are willing to walk in Arlington that would show us whether a half or 3/4 is better?
I'm not sure if the data is going to be there to the level of granularity that you're looking for.
Sure, got it. Okay. It's both important to understand the the data, but also I think that it's clear from the Transportation Commission's, it sort of said strenuously object or specifically say, do this. And I think that there are also value-based elements to this. I'll certainly yield. I do have one more question eventually on primary.
Sure. Mr. Carantonis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That's maybe for Mr. Lavarera. So people walk to transit, but when, so for example, walk to a metro station, but when there are other things that they can do there, when there are services around or they go shop, et cetera, they are normally, or at least this is my experience from my own neighborhood, by the way, they are willing to walk a little bit longer to get more things done. It's not only the accessibility of transit. Transit comes with retail and other amenities. Do we have any insight whether the combination of transit accessibility and main corridor retail and services actually incentivizes more? Is the base for a better, more propensity to walk to these places?
Definitely. I mean, the investments that have been made in efficiency, safety, and capacity of our sidewalks encourages all the commercial and retail amenities in the county. We have we have done a survey, not to what it was discussed before, but the household travel survey has shown us that people are willing to walk to other than work trips. And this regional household travel survey, it was an oversample of Arlington household, and it was performed by COG in 2017 and 18. So we've seen that in those reports.
Thank you.
Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, thank you. Just pursuing this a little bit. Those studies, do they have demographic breakdowns? I sort of assumed that some people find it a lot easier to walk than others. Sometimes younger people are pregnant and have babies and toddlers, and sometimes older people have knee replacements, and some people have accidents, and things happen. Is there a demographic breakdown in that?
There's by age, I believe so. I would have to go through the report, but I believe there's an age and people with kids and things like that.
Yeah, I think that, thank you. I think, as far as having housing available to people in all different kinds of parts of their lives, I do worry about making it difficult for them to live there. We don't want to do that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to ask a few probing questions in this area. First, our existing zoning ordinance, as it looks at single-family homes, requires one space per unit. And in the event that it's a townhouse, it requires 2 spaces per unit, right?
It actually requires 2.2 spaces per unit.
2.2, sorry.
townhouse.
And in the case of a multifamily building, it's 1 1/8 space per unit up to 200 units.
That's correct.
So in all configuration, and if you're located on a cul-de-sac, there's like 2 spaces that are required. Essentially, our current allowable housing types have ranges from 1 up to 2.2 spaces per unit.
Yes.
So what we're talking about, even before any of the options to reduce parking further, are all a net reduction in required parking, period. And so, thank you for confirming that. You can't see his head nod, but he did head nod.
Yes.
So that focuses me to thinking then, okay, if we've already inherently moved towards a reduction, which I think makes sense. Those numbers seem to be of a different era, but they're very much predicated on a threshold level of people not only using transit, but also not having cars. The staff report details that even within those areas that are within 3/4 of a mile of metro, 80% of people still own cars.
Correct.
And have a need for them to be placed somewhere, whether it is on their own property or the public right-of-way. Have you also sort of thought about the recent survey data, and I don't know if it was a statistically valid survey at all, but it certainly got headlines in the paper this week about Metro itself and rail usage, and over the course of the last few years, reflected throughout the region, but also Northern Virginia, people are satisfied with Metro, which is a good thing, but people are riding it regularly less, and the people who ride it rarely growing. Does that in any way sort of factor into how we may think about what are the threshold levels of parking required?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways to look at this, and one is certainly what is the status of zero vehicle households, and we've reported on that. We know that looking at the census data from 2011 to 2021 in that 10-year period, that was the fastest growing segment within Arlington. I think it increased 43% households with no cars. So we know that that's a trend, and also. We want to think about our MTP policies, which are to, require the appropriate amount of parking, but also not require excessive parking. And so that's when we start talking about minimum parking requirements. And so in the staff proposal, in areas where the recommendation is 0.5 parking spaces, that's a minimum requirement. We expect that people will exceed that requirement in many cases. And so the question is really, what should the county as a government be requiring, and should we, how do we have a requirement that addresses community concerns, but also is not requiring pavement for households that may not need a vehicle or are comfortable parking on street? And we know that we have data that in most neighborhoods, we have plenty of capacity to accommodate that.
Thank you. Ms. Crystal.
That was exactly the question I wanted to ask Mr. Ladd. So I just want to maybe reflect it back, see if there's anything else to tease out there. We've talked about the importance, or at least I have, and we've certainly heard it from a lot of commenters about coherence between this policy and other elements of our comprehensive plan, which is the way that we think about the county's long-range future. And so wanted to ask if you could speak to the MTP policy and to really just clarify that the question here is not whether residents of this type of housing might have cars, but where our policy documents guide us to suggest might be in the best interest of the community for them to park those cars. And so to just put a button on what we just heard from Mr. Ladd, and this is in the staff report and quite clear, that the MTP encourages use of on-street parking as an alternative to requiring additional paving. I'll add the editorial note, also tree loss or foregone opportunity for tree planting for off-street parking on private development. I wonder if it might be possible. Either if Mr. Ladd wanted to say more, we have Ms. De La Barrera from the transportation team. I think we also have representation from our Transportation Commission. If they might like to just speak a little bit more about the MTP parking and curb space policy, that management element, and what we should know about that policy decision that has been codified elsewhere in our comp plan to encourage parking, to encourage the use of on-street parking as an alternative to requiring additional paving. Just if there were any additional comments that Mr. Ladd wanted to make, or our transportation team or commission chair, excuse me.
I'll start. I mean, I think you articulated the policies. There's another policy in the curb space management element of the MTP really touches on the costs of parking. And there is a cost to both providing parking, and there is a market cost to renting or buying housing that has parking. And it makes sense. People will pay more for housing that has parking or more parking. And so in thinking about housing costs and related back to the MTP, there's a policy that wants to ensure that the costs of parking are not borne by households that don't require parking. And so there is a risk if the parking requirement is too high and is higher than the needs of the residents, that we're increasing the housing costs for those residents in addition to the environmental considerations that you just raised, Ms. Kresley.
It's a really important point, thank you. And I do see that Chairman Slatt has joined us in case there are additional perspectives on that parking element of the MTP that are the keepers of that element of the comp plan would like to weigh in on.
I would love to. Just a couple of points. One is that the commission has written several letters to the board over the last few years talking about proper management of our on-street parking, that when we see things break down in our on-street parking, it's when we're not managing that parking. And so the tool we have in Arlington right now to manage in these residential areas is RPP. And what we see when RPP management is in effect in our occupancy studies is that these areas are underutilized. We're seeing 40% median usage on these block faces and that sort of thing. So that certainly points to when properly managed, we have capacity here. The other point I would just make is that shared parking facilities are where we get our most efficiency. Land is very important in Arlington, so dedicating space all over the place for parking is less efficient than having a shared facility. And our on-street parking facilities are our shared facilities. So to the extent that which we can encourage that usage, where somebody uses it at one point during the day and somebody else uses it at another point during the day, that's when we get our best, bang, not for our buck, but for our acre. And so that's something that we certainly look to encourage on the commission. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Continuing along these lines, Ms. Garvey and then Mr. DeFranti.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Mr. Ladd a question. You had talked about not wanting to require, I forget how you put it, but hardscape driveways. I mean, they don't have to be hardscape, do they? I'm wondering if I know of some driveways that are illegal because they're actually gravel or grass.
So I think
illegal?
a grass driveway probably is not a legal driveway.
Okay,
but
yeah.
we certainly have, there are pervious pavers, and we see, especially in new construction, most new construction has pervious pavers, not because people love pervious pavers or because they're the most cost-effective option, but because our stormwater management regulations basically require them. So that, certainly that is an option, but that's not the, whether it's pervious or not is not the only consideration. It's also having more parking is less area that's plantable for trees, which we know is a community concern.
Yeah, thank you. I get that. And actually, for anyone listening, there's some pretty cool driveways that have some firm stuff underneath that allow grass to grow up, and they're pretty cool. So anybody's wondering, you can do it. Thank you.
Okay, I think Mr. DeFranti was next.
I would be on to primary, so.
Okay, let's continue with parking if we have any more questions.
Very short
on that.
question that I believe has an easy answer. Just following up on Ms. Garvey's thoughts about people who are not, 100% able individuals, may have suffered an accident or have a disability, mobility disability. We do have a program that assigns a curb parking space with signs and everything that is easy. Now, this is an assumption. It's easy to access once a person has a disability, and somebody comes, puts a sign, and the sign remains there for the duration of this condition, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
All right, so I don't want to perseverate about parking, but I do want to ask a question acknowledging, the important point that you made, Mr. Ladd, that ultimately our minimums are just that, and what will be built and delivered is based on someone's assessment of what the market will require.
Yes.
So there conceivably is another way of getting at the MTP vision and what Mr. Slatt spoke to eloquently, and that are incentives to reduce the amount of parking on site in the form of maybe perhaps more lot coverage, and more bulk or something else, some incentive to actually get people to utilize more on street as opposed to doing what we expect that they will do, and that is delivering the parking that they think the market will require. So was that ever any part of the consideration for this?
I don't think we didn't think specifically about that and our ability to incentivize. I think we'd certainly want to think more about allowing more lot coverage for less parking, because that seems a little counterintuitive, but certainly we could increase building heights is a possibility. These are things that are outside the scope of advertisement for today.
Yeah.
But for future studies, certainly could be considered.
Yeah, I'll just note for my own purposes, the very noble goals of trying to make sure we don't have excess parking that is borne by people who don't need it is actually not facilitated by this to any great degree because, there is, anyway, I'll leave it at that. Ms. Crystal, you wanted to have Mr. Weir weigh in?
No, I was just going to note that we do have representation of the Planning Commission, which I do think wrestled with this question of parking and may have insights for us to shed on this exact question. Mr. Weir, I don't know if you wanted to comment on it, or Chair Emeritus Weir, still shifting to the new year.
Yeah, I'm not going to usurp Commissioner Patel's title and honor. No, the only thing I would add to that is just a procedural one, that the Planning Commission briefly entertained a motion that I introduced actually to recommend a ratio of 0.25 units per parking spots per unit. That motion failed, and the commission ultimately endorsed the Transportation Commission's recommendation. So, there is that additional number in the record. That's the only thing I can add to that, other than, but it, it's not in the record as the commission's recommendation, because the commission endorsed the Transportation Commission's recommendation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dorsey, Mr. Dorsey, Ms. Crystal.
You got it. All right, Mr. DeFranti, you're next.
On parking and the primary transit network piece of this, page 24 indicates that, first, it took a lot of work for me to figure out exactly the boundaries of the primary. There's a map, but it's only portions of Glebe Road, portions of George Mason. And so page 24 indicates that only about 6% of people within a quarter mile of primary transit network would go without a vehicle. I'm certainly, Mr. Slatt, I didn't see you there. My apologies, but I'm certainly interested first in staff and, the survey sort of doesn't seem to indicate that a lot of our, and perhaps this is a communications by the board, but a lot of our primary transit network only residents feel that bus is a viable transportation option, a truly accessible option. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that, the 6% and the other piece.
Well, certainly, if you look at the table on page 24, we see, the highest proportion of households with no vehicle is based on Metro, and then it tiers down to our premium transit networks, and then we do see twice the rate of zero-car households within a quarter mile of the primary transit network as we do outside. But you're correct; it's only 6%. And so I'll perhaps turn it over to Ms. De La Barrera to see if she wants to add anything about the primary transit network and that.
Thank you.
So the primary transit network is defined as a high-quality, high-frequency transit service along primary development corridors. And it includes higher frequency bus service of about 15 minutes headways, 7 days a week. I just want to make sure we get to define that. It provides a really good first and last mile connection to Metro and premium transit network as well. So that was sort of the rationale, what we thought a quarter distance would be effective.
Thank you, Ms. De La Barrera. And Mr. Slatton, then I have a last question, then I'm done.
I'll just be very brief and say, to some extent, today's primary transit network is hopefully next decade's premium transit network. But in order to get there, we need more people living there. And so I think having EHO's transit proximate helps get us there to support the ridership needed to make that investment. And that's definitely that was in the commission's letter, and I think an important part of making sure that the primary transit network stays inside our transit proximate definition. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, both those points I am likely later to fully agree with, despite all my questions. So the only other question I had is just on the, and maybe there's a short answer, but certainly if, Mr. Slatt, if you also have an opinion, I don't feel like the residential parking permit would need to be looked at again just based on this action. There would have to be enough units produced to make that broad look worthwhile again. At least that's my take, but I don't know if you or Ms. De La Barrera have a different thought.
I think to address it just briefly, the underlying methodology for which blocks can receive the residential permit parking doesn't change.
Sure.
With this.
Great. Thank you very much. And unless you say different, Mr. Slatt. Yep. Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think we're ready to move on. And next is the 6th series, which is trees, followed by condo co-op conversions, the 8th series. Any questions on landscaping and trees? Ms. Garvey.
One question for Ms. Kaur, and I think I know the answer, but just double check. So if we adopt the minimum, the minimums in the manager's recommendation, say in another year, the General Assembly changes and we suddenly have more power to do more things with trees, we could come back and change that section, right?
Yes, you can change any section of the zoning ordinance.
That's kind of what I wanted to hear. Thank you. Yep, just making sure.
Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So in the event that these positive developments at the level of the General Assembly don't occur, we are working right now on our natural resources master plan update, and we may find that this plan, recommends a denser or is more granular in the way it requires to grow a urban forest and care about our tree canopy. Would this automatically update this ordinance, or would this take a decision action by the board to do so?
So the draft forestry and natural resources plan is proposed to be a new element of our comprehensive plan. And so that is, as we've talked about earlier with other elements of the comprehensive plan, that's the county's policy for its future in terms of growth and land use and natural resources and all the other elements. So nothing that would be adopted under that plan would automatically change anything. There could be recommendations coming out of that plan that would, require a future zoning ordinance amendment for the board to consider.
Thank you. So I understand. So there has to be a deliberate action to update, to proceed with any update here separately and according to the recommendation of the plan if these come through. Question for our county attorney. So from the Arlington Tree group, we received some very interesting, in my opinion, interesting recommendations for to do two things. First, to distinguish between the size of shade trees, smaller and bigger, and secondly, different numbers, like higher numbers instead of 8 on instead of 8, 12 in a R20. So these are out of scope right now.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're ready to move on, I believe, to 8, which is the condo co-op conversions. We'll probably get through these next few pretty quickly because I believe we didn't have much discussion on them before. Seeing none, moving on to 9, the duplex definitions. Continuing on with 10 series, planning district applicability. Ms. Crystal.
This is largely just to highlight and can have staff confirm the plan regarding the Cherrydale revitalization district, because I think that is probably the area where our planning district feels least fresh, so to speak, and there has perhaps been development of the opportunity that has essentially rendered a judgment that those single-family homes or properties, our district properties rather, would probably not be swept into a larger development as envisioned by the revitalization plan. I wanted to just call out the plan regarding the Cherrydale Special Revitalization District is to address that, and not to address that at some far off date in the future, but to address it expeditiously, to address it not through the zoning ordinance, but by making potential changes to the Cherrydale Revitalization District, which would be amendments to the GLUP, right? And that would be brought forward the changes would be brought forward concurrently with the Plan Langston Boulevard recommendations. Have I got that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Fantastic. Okay, I think that's an important one. So that will be later this summer, not kicking off, but concluding any recommendations there for the interested property owners from whom we have heard, a couple of from whom we have heard during this process. I really appreciate staff's thinking on that.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're done with that one. How about gross floor area? And then we'll conclude with accessory dwellings. Questions on those two? All right. We are concluded with questions. I'm going to give you all a going once, going twice. All right, sold. All right, for the purposes of then iteratively walking through a way to deal with all of these, I'm going to make a motion, and I'm going to ask Ms. Kaur to pay close attention since we didn't coordinate before, so I'm going to hope that I get this remotely right. And Ms. Jacobs, if you'll have ready the memo, but I'll read it and hopefully we'll adjust as necessary. Colleagues, I move that the county board adopt the following elements associated with the missing middle housing study. 1, a resolution shown as attachment 1 in the staff report to amend the general land use plan booklet and map, which is attachment 2 of the staff report, and 2, the ordinance, that's attachment 3, to amend, reenact, and recodify the Arlington County zoning ordinance, including Articles 3, 10, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and 18, to establish regulations for expanded housing option development for property zone R20, R10, R8, R6, and R5, attachment 4 of the staff report, with an effective date of July 1st, 2023, in a manner that incorporates elements in sub-item A and sub-item B. Sub-item A is to incorporate the county manager's recommendations for sites located within GLUP planning districts, maximum gross floor area, minimum parking requirements, tree requirements, accessory dwellings, conversion of non-conforming dwellings to condominium cooperative, duplex definition, and all other elements of the zoning ordinance amendments in attachment 4 of the staff report, which include but are not limited to by right approval for site area up to 1 acre, special exception approval process for site area of 1 acre or greater, building height and setbacks, main building footprint, accessory uses, site development standards, sign standards, general parking requirements, Board of Zoning Appeal use permits and nonconformities. And that's the staff report dated March 10th, 2023. And then sub-item B is to incorporate the recommendations detailed in a memo from Chair Dorsey dated March 20th, and which is being displayed on screen concerning allowed uses, including maximum number of units within multifamily buildings, minimum site area requirements, lot coverage, and annual limit on permits, including sunset provision.
Second.
All right, moved and seconded by Ms. Crystal. I'll speak to this a little bit at length, hopefully not too long. So what you see here is a proposal to put on the table that option 1A be adopted, and that is to allow uses up to 6. That's duplexes, semi-detached units, or otherwise known as side-by-side duplexes, townhouse rows of maximum of 3, and multiplexes up to 6. 2, that the minimum site area be what is widely known as option 2A, which duplicates the existing minimum site area standards that exist for single detached dwellings. For lot coverage, that it adopt the option known as 4A, which does not, reallocate any lot coverage bonuses inherently and automatically to EHOs. And that 4, implements a development cap and sunset provision that proposes 58 permits with a distribution model that is contained in the column in blue, which would provide for those 58 caps to be available in R20 at a number of 4. These are annual permits, R10 at a number of 11, R8 at a number of 6, R6 at a number of 30, R5 at a number of 7. Those numbers, the calculations on them are an allocation of 3 per zoning district as a base, and then a proportional share of the remaining balance up to 58 according to the share of that district's number of total parcels in Arlington. That is the substance of the motion, and I would speak to it briefly by explaining these choices. At the point in time at which the memo was developed, it's uncertain what the majority of the board was interested in, so this reflected a best guess at the time. As it relates to option A, up to 6 uses, up to 6, that seems to be something that we did not have a lot of discussion about, so yay for me. I think I got that one right. And this really is based on the whole idea that the extensive analysis that was done beforehand showed clear viability in the terms of what could be built on units within all of these districts. And while the size would vary depending on the size of the zoning district, clearly there were configurations that were available, R5, 6, 8, 10, and 20, that could accommodate up to 6 units. Doesn't guarantee that that's what would be built, because that's subject to other regulatory requirements up to and including maximum GFA. However, it clearly is viable. Option B, the recommendation for 2A, if Ms. Jacobs can scroll up a little bit more. So this really ultimately creates a level of parity with what we have existing for single-family districts. It, in my opinion, reduces the amount of noise that comes with playing with the zoning ordinance. There's a lot of noise that is already built into the zoning ordinance, arbitrarily determining what lot sizes are normative and minimum and maximum and everything else, and coming up with ways of controlling outcomes on that that are not really based on good planning principles. And so this is an attempt to make sure that that is completely normalized to the extent that we can. So really, at the end of the day, by adopting a 2A minimum site area standard, The thing that will be regulated is what is regulated right now. And the size of any structure that may go on any site is limited by standards for lot coverage, setbacks, building height, parking, tree canopy requirements, RPA requirements, all the same things that limit development today while not introducing any other extraneous requirements that could distort and possibly make viable and even desirable projects infeasible. Moving forward, 3, lot coverage. From our conversation today, I may not have hit the mark here, but we'll see. Again, consistent with the whole idea of introducing the least distortion, what people have come to expect in terms of what they see is governed by this being available through the bonus, through the delivery of certain site improvements, and this maintains that. That's all I'll say about that. And then the development caps, which we've had a significant amount of conversation about, and there are a number of ways to think about this. I'll say for me, the issue of caps is not at all, and I want to be clear on this, it's not uncertainty about whether missing middle types work in Arlington. They exist in Arlington, and they contribute to a vibrant neighborhood and community character throughout Arlington, from Radnor Heights to East Falls Church to Westover to Penrose. All throughout Arlington, you'll see communities that have missing middle types interspersed, creating a vibrance that I think is quite wonderful. Projections that we have based this entire study on are premised on a couple of key things. One, that these expanded housing option types would be a share of existing development activity, not grow that development activity, but be a share of it. That's what we projected. We also projected that, or implicitly projected, that they would occur randomly. We don't think that they would necessarily be concentrated in one place. I believe that that's actually how it's going to play out, but I'll be humble and admit I can't guarantee that. I can't say that for sure. And one of the things that has certainly come through the community conversations, some of the things that people are most concerned about are market-altering changes, market-altering activity, concern that there would be an impact too great for us to do anything about until consequences were realized that were far too significant for us to deal with. And given that I believe that this will be modest and dispersed, and that is in many ways what the staff analysis in terms of impacts that we would need to account for is based on, it seems that a cap simply guarantees what we were expecting to happen in the first place. So that's why that recommendation is there. Anyway, enough about me. I know we're going to walk through and have extensive conversation and potential amendments to any and all of these. So let's get after it in the same order that we went through questions and discussion, starting with the number of units. Mr. DeFerranti, number of the allowable uses, excuse me.
Allowable uses, I'm fine.
Okay. You're just getting in the queue for 2, huh?
Well, I think that, nuclear negotiations may be less focused on than option 2.
All right. Slow your roll. All right. Anybody else for, okay, we're good. 2. Oh, thank you.
Thank you for the description of why you're supportive of 2A. You mentioned a couple of things. First, I want to share that a little context, if you'll indulge me. In January, I placed an emphasis, and I have placed an emphasis on consensus, not unanimity, but consensus. But I deeply believe that consensus needs to be based in the realities of what can be done on a lot. And so 12,000 square feet and 2E is too much. I saw it in my own neighborhood. I saw that I believe on a 10,000 square foot lot, you can fit with some parking off street, and we'll get to parking, but you can fit a sixplex. And that's the same size as a single, it has to be, as all of this has to be the same size as a new single family lot. Could be, with the setbacks and the height the same. So I think it is unreasonable to say that that was my standard that I struggled to articulate in January. And it was parking was the concern and true accessibility. I think it's not reasonable to say that there has to be on-site parking for each bedroom in each unit. And 6 times 2 is 12. I think that's an overcalculation of the number that we should require. So I'm not interested in 2E. I also think there's some people who believe that the space in front of their lot on the street, they have a particular right to. And that's not my view. I think residential parking permits are reasonable, but that's the public right of way. And so we should use it to park cars. All of that leads to me saying, being interested in 2C, and I have a slightly amended version that I'd like to see if we can ask our clerk to put up. It reflects a couple of different pieces. First, I think I should go first to the half mile that's under number 1. I appreciate very much the conversations I've had with Mr. Slatt, a couple of transportation experts. We have a transit plan that's going to be updated later this year. And I believe I sort of put myself to the test. Would I walk 3/4 of a mile in the months of May through November? And I probably wouldn't to get to Metro yet.
Mr. DeFranti, if I could ask if you could just sort of explain your amendment and then see if there's a second before we get into an extended discussion on it.
My apologies.
That's all right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, fair done. So that's why I say a half mile instead of 3/4 of a mile. Under C, I strike 1/4 of a mile from the primary transit network because I don't think that we currently actually meet that 15-minute standard as well as we will after we get a number of the facilities done. The third change that I've done is at the top, and that refers to the minimum lot size. Because my other 2 steps, well, I've just simply taken down the square footage minimum, the tiering, if you will, by 1,000 square feet, because as I looked at our 8 lots and a number of other lots, I believe we can fairly fit additional. So that is 2C.
Okay.
My
So
2C.
Mr. DeFranti has moved to C. Is there a second?
I'm happy to second that.
Seconded by Ms. Garvey. Now let's get into discussion. Is there anything that else you would like to say in support of that motion?
Well, it's fair, I did jump the gun a little bit on explanation and the why. I will say good planning principles include transit-oriented development. And if you contrast 2A and 2C, 2C advances that ideally our 5 and 6 plexes would be built near transit to start. Now, there were some compelling speakers on Saturday who noted the concern of the climate crisis. But for me, keeping a transit-oriented development 2.0 is useful. And that's why I think that 2C has advantages. I want to be clear about what I'm concerned about. It's not R10 primarily. It's the smaller lots where we're trying to allow to shoehorn larger sixplexes on that are not near transit, that I think there is a reasonable policy basis for doing this. So I think you're correct that there's clarity in 2A. I think on balance, 2C is a way to keep our transit-oriented development while allowing for 5 and 6 plexes on our larger lots, and that's why I offer it.
Okay, thank you. Continue conversation. If I could ask Mr. DeFranti, I'm not quite following the linkage between how this better promotes transit-oriented development than the other alternatives, whether 2A or anything else.
Well, 2A allows 5 and 6, to my understanding, 2A allows 5 and 6 on any lot irrespective of transit proximity.
Subject to other regulating requirements. Right.
So this is an incentive. This, for example, there's, a number of neighborhoods that I have engaged with, Arlington View and Halls Hill to be specific, where this would have a different impact. And I've tried to engage with neighbors there, but neighbors, to be fair, in many other neighborhoods, that we would not be as quickly saying by right 5 and 6.
Mr. Carantonis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Mr. DeFerenti, my question is, so the essential difference is that in R6 and R5, the threshold for 5 dwellings or 6 dwellings is higher, 9 and 10,000 square feet, correct? So the concern that one would have is that this would reduce the viability of smaller lots for this kind of dwellings altogether. This viability is already constrained by setbacks and by other, issues. So my question is whether, aren't you concerned that this is a little bit, it's taking too much potential capacity, for the future? I understand the concern that small lots, but small lots close to transit, for example, should be potentially a little bit more viable.
Sure.
Especially because they're close to transit.
Sure. So your concern is what led me to drop 2C from 9,000 and 10,000 to 8,000 and 9,000 square feet, because I wanted more capacity, wanted for 5 and 6 to be available broadly by at least half, and I believe 2/3. I've done a precise calculation. So that's part of how I tried to address that. And I also, to the second part of your comments on transit, that's why under 1, there are those exceptions. You may be arguing, and, I'm not, I support a half mile, but I'm not going to die on the hill of a half versus 3/4. I do support a half mile, but 1 is an attempt to answer your transit capacity concerns.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm supporting this because in general, I think we don't know exactly how it's all going to play out. I have concerns that people have expressed about a small lot being completely covered with multiple units, because people don't do that with large houses usually. Sometimes they do, but you don't tend to build that big a house. But if you're going to put in a lot of units, you would. And I'm concerned about some of our neighborhoods, traditionally Black neighborhoods, and the effect. So I'm just trying to minimize a little bit the effect as we move forward. We may want to change that in the future, but to start, as I say, I don't think we're completely sure how this is all going to work out, so I'm in favor of 2C rather than 2A.
Ms. Crystal?
Could I ask either Ms. Garvey or Mr. DeFrenti to say more about the idea that somehow precluding options that might otherwise be available would be helpful to our traditionally Black neighborhoods in Halls Hill, Highview Park, or Arlington View?
I'll just say, in my conversations with some folks, I think people are concerned about what's going to happen to their neighborhood, and that they will, the single-family homes, suddenly they will be large apartment buildings, and that it will change the character of the neighborhood very quickly, and I understand their concern.
And so just to be clear, these are the same size as single-family homes? It's just more people in the neighborhood?
Yeah, it's just more likely that you're going to get a larger building. In other words, you're more likely to get a larger building if you've got a lot of units in it. So it is the same size as a single-family home that could be built, but it's more likely it's going to be a whole lot bigger if it's got a lot of units in it. That's what I'm saying. That's what I see. Could be wrong.
I see the chair's looking to get in.
It's the uncertainty of it. That's why, and a lot of my positions as we move forward, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I'm not trying to be argumentative, and I'm not trying to be obtuse. I'm just not understanding. So how does what I'm not understanding about this option is, and hearing these concerns, is a sixplex, according to this, requires 9,000 square feet in R5 through R8, but the same site located within a half a mile of a metro station can be done on as little as 5,000 square feet. what about that transit proximity makes that site area utilization beneficial or acceptable in one instance, but not the other?
Well, if you bought a home in Arlington 30 years ago, you probably never expected that your next door neighbor could build a quadplex or 5 or 6. We are changing that expectation, and we have done a ton of work in order to share that change with our community, and not everyone agrees, but I think that there's a particular additional burden. I think if you buy or if you live very near metro, you expect some density, even more than the single family. And so that is the sort of reasonableness approach that why I think additional units nearer density, that's one reason why I think the additional units nearer density should be more allowable. The second point is that, we have to have a link. I think we have to have a link between 2 and 5. And they should be analogous, and I think that our definition for transit proximity should slightly shift. So that's, I don't know if I've articulated it cleanly, but that's the other reason why I support that.
I mean, I appreciate that. I guess just as an editorial comment, and then I'll leave it to the rest of you, by utilizing the site area standard here, unless I'm missing something, an R5 lot that is transit proximate will be built however it's built and however many units are going to be there. If that same lot were on a bigger site, if that same, here's what I'm getting at. Effectively, the density that you're factoring into is not the size of the building and its impact on a particular site, but it's the number of people. And so by net effect, you're saying certain neighborhoods should have fewer people.
Based on proximity to transit, not anything else.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Carantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. DeFerenti, I will just tell you what is my systemic or methodological concern here. This option, as it is written, links a certain level of service, like at the primary network or premium network. Rail is more reliable, it's service and the physical existence of the asset. It attaches that to land use entitlement. Now, level of service can change very easily. And you already take account of that fact because you say, well, this is 15 minutes. To me, this is not very reliable service. Philosophically, transit-oriented development was always linked to the physicality of the main transportation network and its existence. Mr. Slatt just told us that we have to imagine that the primary network tomorrow will be the premium network and onwards. But this is, with all due respect, wishful. It hasn't happened yet. It may happen tomorrow. And then all of a sudden we will have people worried about their land use and the certainty that you want to achieve about knowing what's going to happen in my neighborhood to something that's extremely volatile, actually. So that concerns me with the option. I can discuss a lot about, what is a more gentle towards a more aggressive or, viability approach on land use. But this is what the issue of linking to a level of service instead of a named arterial, for example, is to me problematic with this option. This is why I'm not going to support it at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion, Ms. Crystal?
I just, as we sort of come towards potentially a vote on 2A or 2A or 2C or another form of 2, I wanted to just make a statement as sort of my general orientation. Mr. DeFranti, if you'd wanted to say more about 2C in response to Mr. Karantonis or otherwise, I don't want to step on your toes in that regard.
Sure, I'll just briefly say that I think Metro Rail is fixed, and I think that a premium transit network is more certain. I will also say that this is what I would propose for now, and part of what I have said is to seek to try to build consensus, because we did hear in the feedback, as in the staff report, that this is one of the concerns mentioned during the 20 conversations. So that's, and I guess I don't feel that we should be litigating level of service. I feel, though, that some standard of accessibility is a reason. I believe in induced demand. I just don't believe that we should have induced demand be 90% or 80% of everything. So once the Better Bus work for Metro is done, once the transit plan is done, I'm certainly open to it. But I feel like there's a reasonableness or an overall accessibility standard. So.
Okay.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, just a couple of comments in support of 2A before we continue the alternatives and your points, which I think were well made. A broader observation about this conversation throughout is I really noticed, I think we are most comfortable in Arlington when we can be really prescriptive, when we're doing a site plan or a public facilities review. I think I've really observed that throughout. And I think what's challenging about a zoning conversation is that zoning cannot prescribe what gets built. It can only preclude, it can only dictate what cannot be built. And so if we were in a command economy, a version of this minimum site area that sought to sort of evenly disperse, I think would actually be quite reasonable. But again, we're not determining what goes where. We are only determining which projects may not be built. I mean, to be a little aggressive in my phrasing, we're only determining which projects would be illegal to build. And so I think that is a very different standard. With regard to form, right, that's one question. We can be a little more prescriptive. That was to, the point I'd make in response to Ms. Garvey, concern about the size of the building, right? That's sort of baked into this proposal, that this needs to be consistent with what could be built for a single home. But when it comes to uses, again, that threshold conversation is which uses should be illegal to build where. And I think it's just really notable. We talked about the staff's proposed amendments to the GLUB change, and they wrestled with this question of, are we changing the basic density? And the answer is no. I mean, the difference of going from 1 unit to 6 can feel big for that neighborhood, I get it. But in the standard of how we have done planning in
Ladies and
Arlington,
gentlemen, you know what? We don't. It's not appropriate. We don't need that. You can have your own opinions about it, but that's entirely unnecessary. I really would appreciate your cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to continue the conversation with our colleagues, which is what this is at this point. So I think all of which is to say, I really respect the idea orienting density around transit, right? Like this is so central to who we are as Arlington. But I think that is a concept that we are, I would suggest not accurately, we are importing from conversations about much higher levels of density. And so ultimately for me, again, that question of what should be illegal to build, not what should be constrained by the site area and lot coverage and tree requirements, et cetera, because 2A bakes all of that in. But what should we take further steps to prohibit? I can't find any justification for that. So I'm supportive of 2A as well as included in the manager's mark.
Is there any other discussion on the proposed amendment to include 2C within the main motion? Mr. DeFranti, would you like to respond?
Sure. So first, it seems we are changing, it feels with this overall vote that we are changing the way we do planning. And for those categorically opposed to missing middle, the state of California is a mess because they did not deregulate, loosen regulations. And so I'm all for changing that direction. I just find it a little difficult because our site plans are super, and our GLUBs, special GLUBs, are super prescriptive. And so that's me arguing reasonableness. I am not the best of listeners, but I do think that there are 3 votes not supportive of the amendment listed. And I'm happy to change because I don't want to die on a half mile versus 3/4 of a mile. I don't think that any of the 3 of your comments necessarily you would change your views based on 3/4 versus a half. So I would like.
The option is yours. You know, it's been moved and properly seconded. It's earned a vote, but you're also welcome to withdraw it. It's your choice.
I'd like to seek a vote on the option as listed here. And I'm mindful that sometimes you lose votes, and I don't think that the other option is per se wrong, but I do think I'd like a vote if that's possible, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Is there any further discussion, Mr. Carryover?
Just as a point of order, if a vote is considered for 2C, after, if the vote is not affirmative, we revert to the discussion about 2A. Is that correct?
Unless there's another amendment that is proposed.
Which is a conversation after this vote.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Mr. DeFranti?
On the amendment, I think we've had fair.
Okay, your light's still on. That's
Sorry. No. No. On the amendment, I think.
all right. So we're now ready to consider Mr. DeFranti's motion to amend the main motion to include option 2C, which is presented on the screen. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Nay. The nays have it, 3-2, with Ms. Garvey and Mr. DeFranti in the minority, and that motion fails. We'll now continue discussion on the main motion. Mr. Karantonis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In all honesty, I want to, first of all, thank all of you because we had a thorough conversation about all the options before us. I came down to the option 2D, as in Denmark. This is line 120, page 57. Option 2D maintains the philosophy of trying to replicate the zoning system that we have today, the residential zoning system we have today. However, it changes the minimum viable lot size for R5, the smallest zoning designation district, from 5 to 6,000 for 5 and 6 dwellings for the larger units. And to me, this is an important. This is important. So the R5 districts are not. We don't have too many, but we have significant ones. They are down in Crystal City, in Aurora Highlands. Sorry, not Crystal City. Next to Crystal City, Aurora Highlands, in Arlington View, which is a old black neighborhood, in Columbia Pike, in Columbia Heights, around Virginia Square, across from Lyon Park. So I think that while I understand the philosophy that has permeated the discussion of all the time, that look, these are the minima, but we have so many other conditions. You have to come through with these. So it's not going to happen that you will see 6 dwellings on a 5,000 square foot lot, or at least it's not only highly unlikely. It's basically it doesn't fit. However, it's a good thing to be a little bit more considerate in describing the minimum lot size on our 5 districts. In addition, I would like to, in this motion 2D, in this version 2D, I would like to also propose to have a small change. So under non-conforming lots, of which we have quite a few in Arlington, these are smaller lots than their successive, like their corresponding R district. Under 2B, this is the penultimate line on site 57, it says 5 and 6 dwelling units subject to following minimum area requirements, 6,000 square feet for 5 and 6 units. And I would like to propose to change that from 6,000 to 7,000. The reason why, and I asked staff
Okay,
before.
so before we have extensive discussion, let's just make sure we've got it. You are
Okay.
moving option
2D,
2D with an amendment to the text.
with an
and
amendment to text.
2B to change what is currently listed
6,000
at
to
6,000 to
7,000.
7,000.
Yes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Ms. Crystal. Please continue, Mr. Carantona, speaking to the motion.
So this is, I argued that the 7,000 on non-conforming lots, there are several that are really small. They are in, also in, some of them are in traditional black neighborhoods. There is still a very healthy viability of 5 dwellings. And I think that this is a reasonable type of compromise between 2A and a more and 2D. The 2D is a compromise between this and more restrictive options.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeFerranti?
Question for clarification. I think I know the answer to this, but I want to be sure. That would apply only to the non-conforming lots and not to the table above where the numbers under R6 and R5 are each 6,000 square feet, or would it apply to both?
I understand that if an R6 is 6,000, it's not non-conforming. It would, if it's under 6,000, it would be non-conforming. This basically sets the addresses non-conforming lots that are, are 8 non-conforming. That would be 7,000 instead of 8,000 that would be otherwise required.
So it, I'm sorry, I didn't quite, so it, the bolded or the highlighted 6,000 is the only thing that would change and not the 6,000s to 7,000s above in the table?
No.
Okay.
The table stays as it is.
Just wanted to make sure I understood. Thanks.
So not to be crass, and please correct me if your understanding is differently, but as I was trying to articulate with 2C, with this one, the net effect is this action does not reduce the potential size of any structure and its relation to its neighboring properties. What it does limit and restrict is how many households are within that structure.
Correct.
And we see that as a benefit to people. How?
I think
As
this
it was
is
cited that this would help our black communities. So even though we're not regulating the size of the structure and its impact on neighboring properties, by reducing the number of households that can occupy that structure, we're helping these communities how?
So this is not only in black. I mean, it's only R5 that is different than 2A. And it's only the 5 and 6 dwellings. So it makes 5 and 6 dwellings in R5 viable starting at 6,000 instead of 5,000 square feet. So that, in my opinion, is a response to the concerns that have been discussed here even before me under 2C, that this seems to be a building that's urbanistically a little bit bigger than it would be today. I understand your concerns. I concede that this is the difference is small and not very important. But to me, and especially in these neighborhoods, and having seen these lots and having seen what fits and how it can fit there, I think it's reasonable to limit that.
Okay. Mr. DeFranti.
And I would just say, I think it's a fair question. There's been an implicit assumption in this debate by various individuals across our community that either density is exclusively good or exclusively bad, and I don't think there should be an assumption or presumption, but I do think that in an effort to at least it is responsive to some number of individuals who I've listened to who've raised concerns, and I also think that the non-conforming is sort of an addition piece. A non-conforming lot is an additional level of unexpected density that responds also to some of the concerns. And so that's why I'm supportive.
Okay, any further discussion on 2D? Ms. Crystal?
I'm prepared to support this. I think it is relatively circumspect in what it draws out. And I wanted to just sort of observe as we talk about taking the temperature of the community. I think the importance for me that this, one of the few perspectives that does seem to be shared among those concerned with the neighborhood bases, on a neighborhood basis, is that this be borne across the county. And this not be something that clusters around a particular neighborhood or particular region of the county. In my case, I think the benefits of more households, particularly more households who can buy in at price points lower than certainly what the market is currently providing, outweigh any drawbacks. And I think from a place of positive vision, that is an opportunity that every neighborhood should have and welcome. And so I believe this proposal, well, not my first choice, is one that is, again, relatively circumspect in how many projects might be precluded or drawn out, and therefore how many neighborhoods might have the benefit of this, is one that I can support.
Thank you. Any further comments? I'll just say for me, it appears that I'm going to lose this vote, and I too, Mr. DeFerranti, am comfortable with that outcome. I will say just at the end of the day, it doesn't fit within, my overall goal to bring as little noise in our zoning ordinance and as few arbitrary barriers in our zoning ordinance. I understand the point of view. I understand your desire to help, but I will also just point out that this action would in effect, and who knows what the real world impact would be, because again, on these 5,000 square foot lots, I don't anticipate that there would be a lot of 5 and 6-plex projects being proposed. It just really doesn't really fit. But by limiting them to 2 to 4, we are presumably, in the event that there was a case where 5 or 6 were viable and compatible, we are gearing those sites towards delivering fewer units with the potential risk that those would come at higher cost and be less attainable. So that's a real risk. It's a small scale. I certainly think 2D among the options other than 2A is the most desirable. So I'll just leave it at that. And I think, seeing no other comments, we're ready to move to a vote on Mr. Karantonis' motion to adopt 2D with the edit to Section 2B, which changes the non-conforming minimum site area requirements from 6,000 to 7,000. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. The ayes have it, 4-1, with Mr. Dorsey in the minority, and option 2D is now part of the main motion. We're now ready to move on to our next section, which is, Lord knows I've forgotten at this point. Parking? Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Lot coverage, okay. 4 series, right?
I would be,
Any
so
comments?
the-
Mr.
the-
Karantonis, please.
the main motion, as I understand it, Mr. Chair, has option 4A.
That is correct.
I would like to move option 4B.
Okay. Move to motion for 4B, which has been seconded. Mr. Karantonis, would you like to speak to it?
So the reason, first of all, I have to say that I do that with a sense of, as a benefit of doubt issue, because I cannot, nobody can guarantee that the intention here is to provide the ability to add habitable space to an HO building. This is the intention. This is a 5% that otherwise would be a garage, and a detached garage, by the way, that reduces the pervious space, that takes away trees, that makes the yard smaller and all this. Have it, attached to the main building so that the yard is bigger, more available to people, more pervious space. That's the intention. The way lot coverage is handled, this may be converted into parking. During implementation, I will be flagging that, and I will be looking very carefully what actually happens in reality, and what kind of projects come forward and how they implement option 4B. I think this is a good incentive. It's a fair incentive to create EHOs that work, and since we have discussed that detached garage from EHOs is not really a desirable outcome, I think option 4B is a good option to adopt.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'll just say for my own purposes, I'm not sure that your noble goals are actually achieved with this, since we can't guarantee that outcome. So we have to absorb the fact that it could work at cross purposes to some of the conversations that we previously had on minimum site area, for example. But I think that's all I'll say about that. Any further discussion? Mr. DeFerranti, excuse me.
I think I just would refer to the questions that Ms. Crystal asked and the broad sense, and I take your point that there's detail there that it might not result in the outcome, but I'm willing to take that risk because I think that this seems broadly within the sentiment, single-family analogous to EHO and larger numbers of units. So that's why I support 4B.
All right, so we're now ready to move to a vote on Mr. Karantonis' motion to amend the main motion to include option 4B. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it, 5-0.
I said nay.
You said nay.
I was going to stick with you, Mr. Mayor.
Oh, well, you know what, let's do it. We'll call that vote again. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, nay. The ayes have it with Mr. Dorsey and Ms. Garvey in the minority. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
As you could tell, I didn't really feel that strongly about it, so we'll move on. Next is minimum site area. Is that what we have?
That's 2 series. We did that.
We did that. Great. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. Parking. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Crystal.
So I'm in the somewhat strange parliamentary position of wanting to speak to your motion, which is to say the manager's recommendation, if I may, the main one on the floor. I really appreciated the opportunity for pretty extensive conversation during our dialogue. I appreciate how extensively our staff has thought about that cross department, the perspectives that we've gotten from our commissions as well. And I wanted to speak in favor of the manager's recommendation, not only advocate for the way the recommendation answers the question on parking, although I agree with that, but to advocate in particular for how it implicitly frames the question of parking. I don't actually think the question here is, will residents of missing middle forms live car-free or not? There are, I think, as some have been brought up already, and suspect more will be, so many use cases for who will live in these types of housing who will have cars or whose life will include cars, right? Whether that's a family with a kid in travel soccer or a senior that doesn't drive themselves but maybe relies on visits for a daily caregiver, which is a point I think our chair has made. There are absolutely going to be residents of these forms who live with cars and want parking for them. But I think the question is, and we were talking a little bit about this earlier, should it be possible to build the type of housing that residents who are car-free do want? Which is to say, housing that includes more trees and more green space, maybe room for some shared vegetable garden instead of car storage. And I think that there are enough households living car-free near transit now, and certainly enough trends in there being more of them in the future. As Mr. Ladd noted, the rate of car-free households has grown over the last 10 years at twice the rates of general household growth in Arlington wide. And certainly there are more innovations happening in transit, in car sharing, and micromobility to kind of answer that threshold question of, should we as the government be preventing the creation of the kind of housing that would meet the needs of these households who will choose to live car-free? And that's what parking minimums do, right? The question is not, will these units be parked or not, as we've talked about, right? The market is going to dictate certain things that I think we can all expect a fair amount of parking. But should a builder, a homeowner, have the opportunity to try this type of housing that might be attractive to the agreed minority of people who might wish to allocate the precious space that they have towards something other than car storage. I think we should let folks try. I think we should let that level of experiment happen. And for that reason, I think the 0.5 ratio is by no means the most extreme version of this. I know we had talked about a 0 parking ratio in some cases, and I think that may in fact be a bridge too far. But I think the manager's recommendation is a thoughtful one. And again, at least allows the type of households that we are seeing more and more an opportunity to allocate some of that precious space to uses other than car storage.
Okay. Just as a procedural note, we did skip permit caps. We'll return to that after we continue with parking. Yeah, but in the order. Don't worry about it. We skipped it. We'll go back. Go ahead, Mr. DeFerranti.
I have come a long way on parking. It is very important. As I listened to the 20 conversations we sat in on, it is a very significant concerns. As I think back to taking the 96 bus and the 42 bus in DC and how sweaty I would get, we're in a totally different world with the strength of our apps that tell us exactly when something is going to come. But I appreciate the comments you made regarding that we're already coming down, Mr. Chair. I also think that the manager's recommendation has good pieces. I do have an amendment that I'd like to propose that is a little less than the manager's recommendation. And I think the clerk has it, if you could show that. It's not a grand mystery. I would strike the primary transit network at this point. I'm open to considering less in the future, but at this stage, I think it's a reasonable guardrail. Both things can be true, that doubled availability from 3% to 6% is doubled. But if I do the dishes 6% of the time, my wife will not have that. And so I just am not quite there. I don't mean to be too cavalier or ridiculous. That's why I would propose this additional guardrail at this stage, given what we heard through the conversations.
Seconded by Mr. DeFerranti. Further discussion? Ms. Crystal?
I really appreciate this and just wanted to express that appreciation. I think this is reasonable. And I do think generally we are seeing of the households that are willing to orient their lives around transit, this may be the one that is most a stretch. So, and to just be clear, what happens here by deleting that, the sites that are located within a quarter mile of the primary transit network fall into all other sites and have a 1 space per dwelling unit, right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to support this one.
Thank you. I'll say for my own purposes, I found this parking thing interesting because I've had so many conversations about parking. And the policy conversation that we're having today is certainly a useful one. It's a great one. But I am cognizant of the fact that absent people who may redevelop their property into EHOs who are interested in parking, these decisions about what parking will be delivered are not going to be made by people who are having these parking conversations. It's going to be made by others. So I largely think our conversation is not moot, but we have to recognize that other people who have maybe different perspectives and points of view are going to be making these decisions about what's actually delivered. And when you think about it practically, particularly if there's ownership product that comes from this, I can't imagine a circumstance where a side-by-side is going to come with 1 parking space for the 2 of them to share. I guess it could, but I can't imagine that it would. I can't imagine that the townhouse cluster of 3 is going to have the availability of 2 where 1 is just going to be left out. Could, but I don't expect that it would. That said, this is also what we hope will be a zoning ordinance that better reflects the community that we live in decades from now. And we do hope that the trajectory continues towards people adopting more sustainable ways of getting around, up to and including being car-free. I wouldn't be me if I didn't just know we ain't there yet. And even though the numbers have grown a lot, when the number's really small, you can actually chart a significant amount of growth and still be at, within 3/4 of a mile of metro, 80% of people owning a vehicle, and, let alone all of the other ways in which vehicles still serve households. But the policy conversation really doesn't need to pervade the zoning ordinance. I think this is reasonable. I'm comfortable with it. We'll recognize Mr. Carantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm also comfortable with Mr. De Ferrante's amendment here. I fully subscribe to Ms. Crystal's description of the rationale why, in fact, minimum parking requirements begin to show their age as a policy tool. For not saying that they are almost about to be absolutely useless as policy tool. Not only because practitioners in the marketplace will make these decisions eventually, but the determinants of these decisions begin to be more complex. So we're looking at the beginning of the electrified mobility era. We have seen improvements with micromobility. Walkability becomes better in Arlington. We are, it's not only the need, the perceived need for parking, but it's also all the other options that are available to households. But I think that this is a conversation that we need to have in depth when we are going to discuss the master transportation plan. I think it's reasonable to respond right now with a few more conservative assumptions and go with that for this moment.
You. Ms. No, we're good. And just to note, for good governance purposes, there is a part 2 to this, which also allows for a reduction should, and I want to confirm this with staff, this would be should some sort of a permit applicant apply for a reduction based on a parking survey, which, according to the following criteria, if they are met, could be granted by the zoning administrator.
Yes.
And that could be any amount from 0.99 to 0.5, even though we know that that would be really based on the number of units total, right?
Right.
Thank you. Okay. Any further discussion on this? So we'll now move to consider the amendment to the manager's recommendation to amend the parking requirement, which effectively, am I getting this right, Mr. De Ferranti, just simply removes the 1/4 mile from a primary transit network as a site location eligible for a minimum parking of 1/2. Thank you. All right. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it, 5-0. Is that our first 5-0? Maybe with the allowed uses. I don't know. We didn't need to vote on that yet. So yeah, we're good. First 5-0. All right, moving on. We go back to the 7 series, the permit caps. Ms. Crystal.
I would like to move a substitute motion to the chairman's mark, which is options 7C, which is, I'm going to make sure our clerk has the right number. It is page 65 of the text zoning ordinance. It would essentially read, during the calendar years 2023 through 28, no more than 58 expanded housing option developments shall be permitted in any one calendar year.
Is there a second? Seconded by Mr. De Ferranti. You may speak to it, Ms. Crystal.
I would, and speaking of being prepared to lose votes, I think I might be the only one on this, but I want to just share a few thoughts about caps and a few thoughts about the downsides of potentially not getting this right. To me, the inclusion of caps is, and I think you put it this way, Mr. Chair, earlier, is an expression of humility, the sort of what if we're wrong. I will say, our estimates about a relatively low number of these forms are not just based on one consultant study, although I think that consultant study was quite robust. They are based on what we know from other communities, that in the first year of Portland's residential infill project or the Minneapolis 2040 plan, the number of units permitted relative to population was generally on the scale of or lower than the 21 projects a year that the PES analyzed and proffered to us in working through some of those potential pro formas. These estimates are also on the scale of what we learned from our own experience when we legalized accessory dwellings countywide. We saw just 20 units, fewer than 3 per year after the first action, and then closer to 27 a year. Oh, I'm sorry, if you could pull up the actual zoning text. That is on page 65 of the zoning text. Thanks you so much, Ms. Jacobs. And then, so we saw just 3 accessory dwellings a year after they were legalized in Arlington, and then after we further liberalized their creation, and by the way, we did that because they were so popular, in 2019, we saw only about 27 a year countywide. So I do think we have reason to feel confident in our estimates. I don't think they've been drawn out of thin air. I don't think that simply allowing missing middle forms mean that they're going to become the predominant mode of even new residential development, let alone dramatically change the dynamics of existing land values. But I also think it's reasonable to make policy with the possibility that we could be wrong, and that's exactly what caps represent a hedge on. So why this instead of the chairman's mark? The trouble for me is what happens when that hedge or that fail-safe starts to threaten the promise of the overall policy. And I think that could happen, and it could warp even the relatively few projects we are likely to get a year if they are too low. To be clear, my worry is not the 1 or 2 projects that come in over the permit or past the permit level and don't get built. I think that is maybe a reasonable enough trade. My worry is that the risk of a too low cap is to create an artificial dynamic of scarcity, which leads property owners and homeowners and property developers in all cases to make different calculations. So to give a couple of examples, if you have a senior who is thinking about whether they want to convert their home into a duplex to move in a family member and age in place versus moving out of their neighborhood, now they have a big question mark, a big expensive question mark about potential timing in their pro-con column. The developer who maybe would like to try a new model with more attainably priced quadplex units now has to decide whether they want to put that project in direct competition with a much higher ROI townhouse or side-by-side project. An affordable housing developer who is operating on a razor-thin margin, who now is thinking about potentially having to carry a project and the growing interest on their debt for acquiring that, for whom an additional calendar year risk makes a whole effort infeasible. And in every single one of these circumstances, when someone makes the choice away from developing EHO because of this risk of a cap or this artificial scarcity, what happens isn't that the modestly sized starter home stays intact and sells for an affordable price. It's that the sold property is going to be redeveloped into a large and very expensive single-family home instead. So those are some really high costs, potential risks of a tool that's really about being a fail-safe. I think that it's important that we keep our caps at a level that is reasonable to manage the impact on our community and across zoning districts, high enough and the time horizon short enough that they allow us to intervene if all of our indicators are wrong. I think that's what caps are about, but not so high or for so long that they actually end up denying us the early success stories if all of those estimates are right. So I really appreciate the consideration and the opportunity to make the case. I think we maybe have not really thought about the downside risk of setting those caps too low, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to try to make a plea for it. Thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. Mr. DeFerranti and then Ms. Garvey.
My second was probably more for discussion than for, I'm not quite there, but I was, because there's a lot of pieces in the caps, I heard 2028, and I know that was much discussed, but you're offering the text as it is here, and your rationale makes sense to me, but I'm not at 58. I'm at, as we've discussed, a little smaller sense, and not quite the chair's mark, but I think we had 2 or 3 speakers on Saturday who talked about, certainty is a key in knowing the standards is such a key in this. So I hope that gives a little context. I'm also mindful that we have a number of different pieces that we will want to discuss on that. So I misheard the 28 and didn't quite know that this language. So I'm not there on this. I appreciate the sentiment. I think that the guardrails need to be tighter, but not, frankly, as tight as the chair, with due respect to the chair.
Due respect noted. Ms. Garvey.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not going to support this at the moment. And it's a difference in approach. I have concerns that we don't know how it's going to work out, and I have more concerns of certain neighborhoods being overwhelmed than I do of something not getting built in 1 year that might get built in another. So I am not supporting the current motion.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I moved originally the RTA to include the option of 5 years. And as we heard here, effectively, 3 years would be 2.5, and 5 would be 4.5, 4.5 years. I am very much aware that a cap, especially a low, very low cap, is basically a tool to suppress the development. And also, it has the adverse effect of giving a priority to those who are better capitalized, who have ready projects, who are quick and fast to realize opportunities as they see that, and leaves others who have to find capitalization, who have to work with maybe other types of lenders, because this is one of my biggest expectations for missing middle housing is that we will have a more competitive market with lenders, that CDFIs will be able to fund development, that will have a different market. So I do believe that, so for this reason, I supported a higher number. At the same time, I think that together with the idea of distributing these caps, I do think that we need some time to really evaluate what is actually happening and to be open and accountable to our constituents about that. Because I heard a lot of concern and fear. I don't agree with the majority of those who say that this is going to be a tsunami of speculative development, etc. I think a cap is responding to this concern. Having the buy-in and having the data to show with certain depth of time, with a reasonable depth of time, how this is working is, to me, an important capital that will support, hopefully, will support the deployment of this zoning change and this policy shift on the long term. This is why I am more conservative on this, and I am still on 5 years instead of 3, or honestly 4.5 instead of 2.5.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Crystal, you wanted something else? So in case I lose the opportunity to just say, because I want to make some defense of the original item that was in the mark and just give a sense of what was intended by it, can't say it enough. The whole notion of a cap does send a signal that this is somehow undesirable. And so I want to make clear, that's not the intent here. One of the risks of that must be acknowledged, though, is that we are presuming a certain level of impact in terms of EHOs as a share of development. And based on that assessment, we have made, I believe, the absolute right determination that our capital infrastructure is well able to not only support that pace of take-up in the market, but also to allow us the time to make the appropriate investments in the future as this grows and matures. That's an important conversation that we've had with the community, and it's important enough that I feel like we should commit to it, at least for a period of time, the minimum period of time, to actually have real-world data so that these very ephemeral, abstract conversations can become real based on what's on the ground. So the recommendation for the cap number for 3 years was with some intention, and I appreciate Ms. Crystal's sincerely held concerns about whether or not we lost an opportunity and what that would do to the market. I think that's a well-reasoned concern. I just don't happen to share it, because the risk of the project that may come in over a cap number is not that it becomes a single-family house. It just may mean that it has to wait until the next year when permits may be available, which happens all the time in real estate development. But beyond that, the cap numbers themselves, I'd like to remind everyone, if we were expecting somewhere in the 20s in terms of an annual share of new development, the cap number is nearly triple that. And as it relates to the particular areas, if, for example, the R8 number, which looks low, it's 6, like, we're worried about that. But we have to remember that on an annual basis, at least for the last 3 years, we've had 11 R8 projects. So it's accounting for up to half of those to be EHOs. And while that percentage doesn't persist across all of them, I feel pretty comfortable that at least in the early years, we're not going to come anywhere close to the cap. And the risk is if you keep the cap regime in place too long, you increase the likelihood, whether you distribute it by zoning district or just have it overall, that you could forego some of those good projects. So I'll leave it at that. We'll move, I think, to, oh, you want to respond? Sure.
I just want to respond to really clarify for the record. I want to be very precise. My worry is not the 1 or 2 projects that get shut out by the cap and have to wait another year. My worry, and this has really been echoed by the people who build this type of housing, whether they are affordable housing developers or the Chamber of Commerce in their letter writing us, is that it changes everyone's behavior under the cap. And so a developer who might, for example, bring forward that project that's, so to speak, riskier, is going to instead bring forward the much more expensive version of the EHO. And then what we end up with is the sort of prophecy that we've all been most worried about, that we only get the most expensive forms of this. I am on the losing end of it. I will let it go after that. I just really wanted to clarify. My concern is not the 1 or 2 that have to wait another year. I think I'm with you in thinking that's a reasonable enough cost.
All right. Well, Mr. Karantonis.
Oh, nothing, just a comment. It's really about the size of the sample size for judging it properly. Those who are well capitalized, they will rush into the market. I don't want anybody to, misinterpret this, because in the short term, it's logical to happen. It happens very often. Just having a better sample size, I wish we would get a significant signal, which can be considered by the board when we are going to be reporting, when county manager will be reporting on the performance of the policy.
Thank you. Ms. Garvey.
Mr. Chair, just a question. If this is defeated, that will revert to the chair's mark with your allocation? Am I understanding that correctly?
Correct, subject to any subsequent amendment. Yes. All right, I think we're now ready to move to a vote on Ms. Crystal's motion to adopt the language in 7C, which has been further amended as shown on the screen. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Nay. The nays have it, with Ms. Crystal in the minority, and that motion fails.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Crystal.
Speaking of having humility in policymaking, always have a plan B. So if I may, I'd like to offer another substitute, which looks quite a bit more like the chair's mark, and I think our clerk has it. And this is an effort to essentially maintain the bundling with the larger R districts, because I do, for all the reasons expressed, feel like those numbers are very low. And I think when you see the R20 through R10 through R8 bundled, you're still at a number that is consistent with our estimates. So again, I think we'd be very, very unlikely to see that many in any of those individual districts. I think we'll be fortunate if we see 1 or 2 in those districts. But again, the idea of having more, a higher cap, is not necessarily about getting more of them, but about not changing the behavior or warping the market of what gets built there so that it is only the most expensive of the EHO projects. So I'm sorry, I just explained that without moving it. Let me move that. If I have a second, I have one more point to make about it.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. DeFerranti.
And I also want to be honest, although I do prefer a 3-year cap, I don't want to achieve it by trying to sneak it past anyone. So I will note that by amending the chair's mark, that is consistent with the chair's mark, which includes 3 years, not 5. So that is my amendment on the table. I suspect I may have colleagues who wish to further amend the substitute before a vote.
Okay. Do you still second that, Mr. DeFerranti?
I'm trying to think. I'm happy to second for purposes of discussion.
all
I'm
right.
at a 5-year, not a 3-year.
That doesn't tie you to anything. It just means it's on the table for discussion. All right. Ms. Crystal's explained it. Mr. DeFerranti, you're next, and then Ms. Garvey.
So on the allocation, I'm supportive of this because we have to have more economic and racial diversity in larger lots on R10 and R20. We have to. And so I think that the strict allocation is too narrow for my taste, with respect to R10, R20, and R8. And I think it addresses some of the comments made on Saturday. I would say I think it bears just brief repeating that the number 30 for R6 is based on the fact, in part, the way that the staff report calculates the number of R6. I think R6 make up, if I remember the footnote right, 66% of our overall residential lots. So if folks are watching and they're saying, why so much on R6? It's partly because that's
It's
where
entirely because of that.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, just confirm with Ms. Crystal that her amendment means, so that, this means that 21 units could be built all in an R8 or all in an R10. I mean, just because they're shared, but you're not dividing it up at all. They could all be built in one of the zoning areas,
That's correct.
Yeah.
It also means that, for example, and if the clerk, if Ms. Clerk, would you mind scrolling up a little bit? Yeah, it also means that 5 could be built in R20, which would not be possible under the chair's mark. So,
Yeah, I'm comfortable with the chair's mark for the beginning. Thank you. I'm just worried about, as I said, dispersion. It seems to me really important. I think we don't know how people are actually going to be thinking and what they're going to be doing. So I'm more comfortable with the chair's mark. Thank you.
Mr. Karantonis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Crystal, I am inclined to support your allocation. Our zoning just creates 2 consistent classes of zoning. R10, R20, and R8 are pretty much, contiguous. With exception of an area entirely heights, leeway heights. This is to me a logical separation of allocation of different of these caps. I do think I agree with Mr. DeFerranti. Indeed, R6 is the most predominant. It's 66%, and I'm happy to see that our R5 is treated with distinction, which is a smaller, very dispersed, and it will be interesting to see how this performs. I think this is a logical apportionment of potential development that creates sufficient space for flexibility to see indeed and collect the data. We said before that we want to have some data, so if we have a sufficiently high cap, comfortable cap, then giving it the possibility to work on the territory is just consistent with wanting to see what actually happens on the market. Thank you.
I'll recognize me just because I do believe that some parts of the original proposal have been misinterpreted. So I just want to be very clear that the current one does allocate a disproportionate share of these permits to R8, R10, and R20. In fact, in total, 36% of all permits go to those places. And just to marry this conversation and make it a little bit more concrete, that means that at annual permit rates in R8 of 11, 6 would be available on an annual basis through this, more than 50%. In R10, that number would be more than 20%. And in R20, it would be 400%. So I just want you to know that this does not hold those areas at a reduced opportunity to see EHO development. In fact, it does send an implicit incentive to do so.
We'll note, Mr. Chair, that it was a very wise board member who said at the time of RTA that building these off of the existing construction permits assumes that what has currently been happening over the past few years is normative, and we
Right.
might not want to do that.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Well, it exceeds it.
I know. Perhaps assuming it's normative is not the right call.
Right.
Mr.
DeFerranti, yes.
Mr. Chair, I believe what I have a semi-friendly amendment that I think is acceptable to the author regarding the 3-year versus 5-year piece of things. I would like to, I support 5 years, and that's a piece of why I support the amendment that Ms. Crystal is making, and I don't know how to effectuate that.
Do you accept that as a friendly amendment?
I am not going to force another vote that will fail, so I do accept that as friendly. Thank you,
All
Mr.
right,
Chair.
since
And
you
Mr.
seconded, that is now your amendment. We won't call it a friendly, we've just been reframed. So this is to adopt a distribution model that includes 21 to be shared for districts R8, 10, and 20, and R6 having a hard number of 30, and R5 a hard number of 7. That's now the motion? Okay. Any further discussion on that? We're now ready for Mr. DeFerranti.
Just two pieces as to why 5 years for me. Very briefly, it's because it's 4.5, 2028 is 4.5 in practice. And also, I want a sample size large enough so that we can really look at this. I know there are different opinions. We talked about this in January. I wanted to make that point. I also have received email, and there were comments on Saturday that touches the question of sunsetting. And there's two ways to interpret sunset. It can either mean that the cap will sunset, or it can mean that the whole EHO program will sunset. I do not support the whole EHO sunsetting interpretation, or understanding, because the language is, I believe, fairly clear that the cap would sunset. But for me, big picture, it is how it sunsets. I believe we're going to have another big discussion in 4 years or before this happens, irrespective of whether it sunsets or not, and we're going to have another big conversation about this. I would like to have that conversation be sufficiently long from now such that we can really focus on other pieces of our housing work, and that's why I support 5 as opposed to 3.
Okay, I think we're now ready to move to a vote on this amendment. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. The ayes have it, 3-2, with Mr. Dorsey and Ms. Garvey in the minority. We are ready to move next to, hold on, got to go to a different screen. All right, so colleagues, at this point, I'm going to open it up to see if anyone has any lingering amendments to offer on any of the other remaining areas, and those include the Glup Amendment, which I don't expect any, but could also include the 6 series trees, 8 series condo co-op conversions, duplex definitions, planning district applicability, gross floor area, or accessory dwellings. Any further amendments? Okay. To recap, we now have a main motion on the floor, which we will move to vote on, which includes allowable uses up to 6, minimum site area of 2D, a lot coverage of 4B, permit caps, which will be at 58 with the distribution model for hard caps in districts R5 and R6, and shared numbers in R8, 10, and 20 with a sunset of 5 years. And parking, which allows for the manager's recommendation with an elimination of the primary transit network as an eligibility and as an eligible criteria to receive a parking reduction. And I believe everything else is as it was described in the manager's recommendation. We are now ready to, how do you want to do it, colleagues? Leave it up to you. Do you want to do concluding comments before the vote or the vote first? It's up to you.
Vote first.
Vote first. Lovely. All right, so we'll now move to a vote on a main motion that includes the elements that I described. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? Hearing none, that motion carries 5-0. We'll now have an opportunity to have concluding comments on this very long but meaningful process on the board, of the board and in the community. And I'll exercise chair's prerogative and go first. And so much has been said about this already. I will try to make this as succinct as I can, but I do have a few things to say. First, as we look back over the last 3 years, originally in March 2020, I believe, is when staff really focused on presenting what would be the goals of the missing middle housing study and community engagement. And those two primary goals were to A, increase the housing supply, and B, diversify the range of housing choices. That's what we articulated then. That has remained consistent throughout. It's important to think about the why. The why It was simply a recognition that growth and change are, period. Not good, not bad, just are. It's happening, and we have a couple of choices when we think about it. We can recognize why that growth and change is happening. We are part of a dynamic, vibrant community in Arlington and within the region that has for generations invested in the kind of living conditions that make this a place that I think most people here value and that naturally other people would be attracted to. That is not a bad thing. In fact, it's a damn good thing. We should all be proud of it. But certainly it's our responsibility to think about how we accommodate that, to make sure that it continues to work well for as many people as it possibly can. Arlington is known for its attention to its planning corridors, where we specifically and purposefully have medium and high density building to accommodate the preponderance of that growth. But as we have learned over the years, as much as that has hewed to good, smart growth principles and has produced wonderful places for people to live, it has produced a predominant housing type that by no means reflects the only way people want to live. There is a desire for them to live in places and in spaces that are different than what is primarily being delivered here. That's not bad either. And when we think about what that should mean is, how do we look at the rest of the areas of our county that hitherto they have been precluded from growing in because we preclude that growth overall. And it's there that I think we should also apply smart growth principles and maximize the efficient use of available space, that we should have bulk and mass that is consistent and also compatible with its surrounding environment. We should leverage public infrastructure. And as we think about the current conditions in our R districts, we've got to face reality. What happens now in our R districts is that those are redeveloped and changed as well. They are changed into bigger structures that have the net effect of accommodating 0% of the growth in our county. Bigger structures accommodate a net 0% of our growth. And I want to put some real numbers on this, just to be clear. The action that the board just took will allow in our districts buildings that cannot exceed 8,000 square feet in floor area. That is what we just did. In Arlington in 2021, 22, and 23, in these R districts, there were 23 such properties that were sold that averaged 8,333 square feet. Those buildings didn't accommodate up to 6 households, they accommodated 1. And if you think that I'm just cherry picking numbers, I'm not. The numbers from 2023, what's available on the market right now, we have 4 homes available that are averaging 8,145 square feet. I really think that we can accommodate growth and make our community vibrant with a better use of 8,000 square feet in our residential districts. And so, as we've looked through this, we've talked about our current system being a vestige of exclusion. I don't need to rehash that here. The history is clear, it's incontrovertible. It wasn't based on effective land use planning principles, and it wasn't based on an eye towards making the community vibrant. And in many ways, it stands in stark contrast with other elements of our zoning ordinance. When you think about a commercial zoning regime, we very much care about where it is, we care about what size it is, we care about a whole lot of things. But you know what we don't care about at all? What goes on inside of that commercial building, right? If the place wants to have 2 tenants, that's great. If they have 100 tenants, that's great too. But we have this interesting sort of difference when it comes to residential structures. Whereas we don't limit our care and concern to the regulatory framework of what it looks like and where it is and how big it is, we also have this zoning ordinance which has said that the number of people you have in it need to be tightly regulated. Like if it's one family, whatever that means, and be as many people as you want. But my goodness, if you want to have 2, 3, 4 households within that building, that's bad. I don't see a basis for that. I see something that is a vestige of old times that doesn't reflect the times that we're in, and certainly the times that we ought to be in. And so when I look at what staff has come up with and what has been refined through the community process over the many months and years, is to really get to a regulatory framework that takes away as much of that bias as possible, takes away as much of the barriers that are not rooted in planning principles as possible, and say, what could we do in Arlington if we took all that stuff away? And from it, we have this proposal which doesn't add any new height, with the exception of the action today to give the 5%, which is de minimis, doesn't add any more bulk. It says, what can we do within what we currently have that can accommodate the growth in a way that doesn't cause harm? And so this action, with the additional guardrails, if you will, of allowing us to see this materialize and learn for a few years to see if any shifts or changes need to be made in terms of the policy, is a way to ensure that we can get rid of all of that discriminatory noise from the past and have a framework that works well for people moving into the future. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't start to speak a little bit about the overall narrative of this. This does stand as a significant advancement toward dismantling government-imposed barriers that are not serving a public purpose and that are limiting our ability to fully realize our vision that's based on inclusion and expanding opportunity. This is a big deal. When we think about 3/4 of our land area being devoted to residential uses that have provided no net gain in the number of households, I find that to be untenable, frankly. And when we think that all of the growth that we have is confined to about 10% of our land area, forcing people into either medium or high density structures without any opportunity to participate in 90% of the rest of Arlington's neighborhoods, I find that pretty indefensible. And when we think about, we don't allow for the supply, the housing supply in those neighborhoods that is more cost attainable, just because it's a different product that's going to be delivered at different price points, that we currently and would continue to not allow that, to me, that's unconscionable. And so I think that this reform moves us to a better place of providing not only equity, but just fundamental good policy in Arlington. And I do believe we put appropriate conditions and restrictions in place that mean it's not gonna do what a lot of people in the community really expressed as a key concern. Let's not have this change come at our expense. Let's not have this change overwhelm us. That is absolutely reasonable. And if they look at the policy that has been enacted, I think they can see that that concern has been very well reflected. I also believe that when we think about it specifically, maintaining the regulatory framework that currently exists for single-family homes, that we have new regulations for EHOs that actually require, whether it be orientation of parking, orientation of entrances, screening of trash and HVAC and other things. We have enabled new conditions that require a degree of compatibility with existing communities, that we've done the best that we can within allowable legislative authority to ensure that tree canopy is normalized between the two, come up with a sensible way to accommodate the desire to promote reduced vehicle usage while at the same time not ensuring any undue impacts spill over into communities. These are all sensible things that are the result of a robust community process. Now, I recognize there are people in the room who don't see it that way. Maybe the 250 people that we heard at our hearings, many of whom expressed strong concerns at all levels of being opposed to this. I certainly know that this is not something that everybody agrees with and doesn't see it the same way. And through that hearing, we heard lots of different words about division and lack of community consensus, and we even heard words about the lack of legitimacy of this board to make these decisions in the first place. Well, without addressing all of those, let me just say to those of you who engaged in good faith in this debate, I applaud you and I thank you. There are a great number of people, despite their strong positional orientation towards one way or the other, nonetheless engaged in good faith, learning all they could throughout the process to solidify their positions, and they held fast to those positions, but also created room to accept and accommodate what might be necessary compromises or accommodations to take into account other views and points of view. I appreciate that good faith engagement because that's the best of Arlington. My money, that is the Arlington way. For those who are against this, I also want to be clear. You're not monolithic. There are people of different ages and different races, different parts of the county who don't agree with this. But as we move forward, I hope that we don't view this as simply people who are for or against, and that this action results in winners and losers. Because the one thing that has become clear is that despite our positional viewpoints on this issue, people really like Arlington. And that's something that should galvanize us and bring us together. And I hope that we can join in this point forward into re-engaging to make sure that we can continue to make sure that this community is doing the right things for each other and doing the right thing for future Arlingtonians. Thank you for accommodating my desire to speak a little bit at length. I will now turn over the floor to my colleagues, beginning with Ms. Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank yous are also in order to our staff. I could not begin to express the gratitude for the extraordinary work and the unbelievable amount of time that you have put in to the proposal that was ultimately before us. My thank you to our commissions and to everyone who has dedicated so much of their time to this issue over the past few years. I really appreciate the number of speakers who've joined us in the past few days, and like our chair, I really appreciate those who engage in earnest with questions. I have been tempted to try to use this time to answer directly some of the criticisms that we've heard, but I am not naive about my ability to persuade those who are most opposed to this action. Only time and the actual impact of this zoning change can do that. I do, however, want to speak to a concern with which I have deeply wrestled over the past 2 years, especially of this multi-year study, and that is the extent to which this action is or is not harmonious with Arlington's smart growth tradition. That history is a mantle that I wear heavily. I reflect on the decisions to underground the metro and to develop densely around it with gratitude, not just as a leader, but a resident of this community and this wonderful place. And I admire those Arlingtonians who dedicated their vocational and avocational lives to building out that vision in recent decades. In short, I know on whose shoulders we stand. But the reason we stand there is to see out further to a greater horizon. Because the moment has come when continuing to rest on our laurels of past innovation leaves us unprepared to meet our future. This is true in terms of housing attainability, it's true in terms of the environment, and it's true in terms of equity. First, hand in glove with Arlington's tradition of smart growth is this community's conception of itself as a place where public sector workers can make a home and build a future. I suspect that these are the folks that so many speakers had in mind when they talked the past couple of days about the residents who built this community. But let me give just one illustration of many. 40 years ago, when the average sales price of a single-family home in the region crested $100,000, that represented just about twice the salary of a federal employee peaking in their career and hitting a GS-15. Last year, the average sales price for a single-family home in Arlington was nearly 9 times the salary of a first step GS-15. And so all of those young and not so young adults who have testified over the past few days that they don't have a future in Arlington without zoning reform, they are not entitled newcomers who expect special treatment, nor do they have an unrealistic idea about the purchasing power that should be associated with their salaries. Rather, they are the exact echo of the generations that built Arlington and who are now shut out for this community. The best way to guarantee a dramatic change in the characteristics of our neighbors is to do nothing. But for our future to look like our past, where Arlington is shaped by Arlingtonians with public servants' hearts and public servants' salaries, we have to act. And that's also true when it comes to climate and to transit-oriented development. Arlington has always been a green community in its values and in its natural resources. But what has changed from those earliest Earth days that focused so much on conservation is the primacy of greenhouse gas reduction as the most existential of our environmental concerns. And the science is clear that denser communities produce fewer per capita carbon emissions than spread out communities. Housing units that share walls use less energy. Density is central to walkability and transit use, which emit far, far fewer emissions per mile than personal cars. Trees and grass and gardens, they are central to this livable, beautiful county. And I believe this policy before us that we've just voted on reflects that. And if we want a future for those trees and every other living thing on this planet, we have got to define environmentalism in terms that prioritize emission reductions at least as much as the protection of individual plants. It is also true that it is a direct result of all of that smart growth planning is economic development that means Arlington is now so much richer in opportunity and access than we were before. We aren't just feeding a workforce into downtown DC. We can now measure distances between homes and jobs within our 26 square miles, and advances in micro-mobility and massive investments in transit and walkability have shrunk those distances even more in practical terms. Given all of this transformation, our big progressive idea of transit proximate development is hardly progressive if it's still predicated on decades-old definitions of proximity. Finally, this community is so proud of its civil rights history, of our resilient historically Black neighborhoods, of our ties to civil rights pioneers, of 4 students in 1959 who made Arlington the county that defied massive resistance. We should be proud, but the bravery of 4 teenagers half a century ago does not absolve us of the responsibility now to affirmatively address and dismantle the sources of segregation that remain. We honor that legacy by continuing to make progress. I don't think, by the way, that these relatively modest changes to allowable densities in our districts actually do represent that fundamental of a break, or a break at all with our smart growth principles. The proposal that we just voted on is fundamentally conservative one. It endorses the current form of a single-family home as normative, and it allows alternatives only insofar as they fit within it. It's also not out of keeping with actions of prior boards that allowed uses of things like family home daycares or forms like accessory dwellings in all districts all at one time. What these changes represent instead is an evolution, which ultimately is what successful and forward-facing communities do. They evolve. I suspect that each one of the 5 of us just cast that vote with a former colleague in mind who embodied the smart growth values of Arlington's past while urging us to focus on the future. I believe that balance has been reflected in the changes that we just adopted, and I am so grateful for the opportunity to support it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Crystal. We'll move next to Mr. Karantonis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Colleagues, like all of you and the overwhelming majority of Arlingtonians on both sides of the argument, I would agree, approach this decision with humility and with a commensurate sense of responsibility that emanates from the realization that housing is always about people, about who we are and about our values. So, as you, Mr. Chairman, mentioned, and Ms. Crystal as well, legacy restrictive zoning came to be for the explicit purpose of separating Arlingtonians based on their color of the skin, their socioeconomic status, or cultural demographics, all attributes that we repudiate today. We have come a long way to reverse the deep historical consequences of past segregation. We're still working on that, and today this board takes another step forward on this very long path. Our past, of course, is our moral compass and the source of deep insight about the place we are today, but this decision is essentially about our future. So I wanted to share some practical thoughts that kept framing my point of view during the hundreds, maybe thousands of conversations with my neighbors in the last couple of years. And I'm really deeply thankful for these conversations across the territory of our county. First and foremost, our path to shared prosperity, economic development. A chronically supply-starved housing market in a chronically supply-starved region has long passed the threshold of causing severe economic pain to all of us. As good as we may be in attracting leading corporations, attracting and retaining a resilient mix of middle-sized companies, their jobs, investments, their people, where if we don't going to accomplish that, we are severely burdened by our lacking ability to offer adequate, attainable housing options. This action today is about reintroducing choice and options at different price points for current and future Arlingtonians. Single-family homes, and I would agree with Ms. Crystal, will continue to be a large part of that diversity, but hopefully not the only choice in the future. Our investment in excellent schools, in parks, in public facilities, in infrastructure, in transportation, public safety will greatly suffer if Arlington becomes progressively unattainable. First, for our medium-sized businesses and their employees, then for our small businesses and their entrepreneurs. Now it's the time to intervene, to shape change on our terms before change shapes us. On the issue of smart growth, I heard concerns that have been raised that Arlington is abandoning its smart growth path by increasing density beyond the planned corridor boundaries. I believe that actually, and I agree with Ms. Crystal on that, the opposite is the case. The transportation, the retail service, the leisure benefits, the efficiency of our urban corridors continue to be at the center of our development model. A slightly higher density in the residential areas realized over decades neither can nor won't change that fact. It is reasonable to expect that it will be actually reinforcing the predominant role of our transportation corridors. With regards to the biggest challenge of our lifetime, the environment and the climate change emergency, we already know, and the EPA confirms that residents in multifamily and single-family attached homes in higher density neighborhoods use about 40% less electricity, 50% less water than residents in very low density areas, let alone the carbon footprint of multi-car dependence for commuting, for shopping, for running errands, and occasionally having to drive students to their many activities. Very low density residential is by design not low carbon. Multifamily households not only tend to own less cars per household, but also tend to generate significantly less trips per household. So a slightly denser neighborhood, after all, can be a significantly greener neighborhood. Less emissions, better stormwater management, less car-centric, more livable in all possible dimensions. I want to say a couple of words about the issue of intergenerational justice. It's impossible to oversee in all this conversation over these years that there is a stark generational difference between proponents and opponents. I can not speak high enough about how much I appreciate and recognize the amazing process, the great community built by generation that delivered us in Arlington a place that can act like we are acting today. But it would be always very unfair to pass significant future-defining problems like housing attainability and affordability, climate mitigation and adaptation, issues with racial equity and income inequality, to pass these problems to the next generation without taking action to prevent all the above from becoming worse, more complex, and way more expensive and problematic to solve. Arlington is in a far better shape and condition than any other community to afford to act today, focusing on our future, which also will make for an even greater community than the one we enjoy today, managing growth proactively and at critical inflection points of our community's history is actually our DNA. This is the actual Arlington way. Also in our DNA is to actively balance competing priorities: housing needs, environmental needs, avoiding displacement of moderate and low-income residents, of seniors, dealing with school enrollment needs. Therefore, it is, in my opinion, the Arlington way to be incremental, but not timid, and have controls in place that allows us to observe very carefully during the initial years of the implementation period of any policy, but keep our vector striding forwards. I've had these conversations with Eric Gottschall about 10 years ago, approximately, and they left a lasting impression of me. Since then, the realization matured that truly enhancing housing options for our Arlingtonians who live here today and those who will choose to live here tomorrow is one of these decisive actions we cannot afford not to take. And I'm very happy that we accomplished to take it today. To that as well, I share the sentiment of thank everybody who engaged in this process, regardless of where you stand in the argument. It was extremely enhancing for my way to see the issues, to understand the pathway forward, to understand the bifurcations, to appreciate the risks, and make sure that we will be observing all together very carefully and apprising what is actually happening in the actual field, in the market, and be very centered of the equity questions. Who does it benefit? Who does it burden? Who is missing? And what we do about that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Karantonis. Next is Mr. DeFerranti.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 101 years ago, Arlington was born out of Alexandria County. Since then, we made two major land use decisions before today. In the 1930s, we banned row houses and non-single-family homes to exclude African Americans from moving to Arlington and dilute the percentage of Black residents living here. The ban on row houses was not repealed until the late 1960s. Second, in the late 1960s, early 70s, we undergrounded the Orange Line and invested significantly in transit-oriented development, and that has led to our overall prosperity over the last 50 years. I believe today we are making a next big land use decision, not because change will happen overnight or even over the next 5 years in a big, big way, but because over time, this will provide for a less expensive set of housing options than the status quo. And because as soon as this is effective, it will end exclusionary zoning. Our vote today is a significant refinement of the General Land Use Plan Amendment that we made in 1970, an important change to what has been referred to colloquially at various points as density in the corridors and leave the single-family neighborhoods alone. I believe we should acknowledge that leaving the single-family neighborhoods alone can both be described as a transit-oriented development strategy that led to growth in our population and our economy. But it also can be described as the continuation of regulatory action by our county government that has protected the wealth of those already living in single-family neighborhoods and prevented those who do not live in those neighborhoods from building wealth of their own. None of us alive today is personally at fault for the county decision on row houses from the 1930s to the 1960s. All of us have a responsibility as Arlington residents to live our ideas of equal opportunity and inclusion. And those of us on this board have a particular responsibility to enact policies that align with our community's values and realize the faults and imperfections of all of us, including some of what this body might have done in past decades. We must work to help make Arlington's economic ladder work better for our children and our children's friends and our residents of color. As Ms. Crystal said, that 15 times delta is not acceptable for a GS-15. With that policy responsibility in mind, my goals for missing middle are the same today as they have been throughout: incentivizing affordable homeownership, encouraging the production and preservation of family-sized units, and flexibility in housing types and residential units in single-family neighborhoods. The set of policies we approved will move us forward on those goals. Specifically, allowing duplexes and townhomes is something I believe we should all be able to agree upon if we think about it. Most all Arlington residents that I talked to last year believe that is reasonable. Fourplexes, fiveplexes, and sixplexes are admittedly more controversial. Ultimately, I believe the goal of flexibility and the specific need to economically and, yes, racially better integrate our neighborhoods, as well as the environmental climate benefits of this policy with respect to those three types of units, make this the right thing to do. I listened to the 232 speakers who have presented to us over the last week, and to the many thousands of Arlingtonians who emailed us, came to the 20 listening sessions, and participated in organizations both against missing middle and for it. A significant majority of the emails we received and one large petition were against it. Many organizations, forums, renter pop-up sessions, and I would respectfully submit the 85,000 voters who voted in last November's elections seem to be at least open to it, not categorically opposed. Arlington residents have shared my views in their words. Hector Herrera shared his American dream of attainable homeownership after years of work in construction. Malathi, a university professor, asked to think about the future, as she is a single mother who wants opportunity for her children. Michaela, Kathy, and Kip asked me to think about the possibilities if more of our teachers lived here. Josh and Dean pointed out that climate change is a crisis and moved me forward this past Saturday to think bolder. Esther shared her powerful story as the first in her family on either side to go to college. Marjorie made me think about my own neighborhood and my responsibility to live by my own values as they impact my own home. The more I considered the specific concerns opponents have raised, the more I believe the facts support what we just passed. Stormwater and flooding are a challenge for us, but the work our staff has done leads me to conclude that we will need and are planning for significant investments in our system of drains and pipes and streams to meet the challenges of climate change, irrespective of missing middle. School capacity, if we look at the frequently asked questions and the analysis, we do have relocatable classrooms, and that's a challenge. But missing middle will add 9 to 13 students per year. And in the context of our overall system, that's not a lot over the next 10 years. Parking, the number of single-family parking spaces is limited. That's a challenge that we can handle. Infrastructure, the staff report points to newer plumbing that is already reducing our water and wastewater systems, and I believe we can meet that challenge. The traffic, the data shows that our traffic is down in the major corridors. We can handle that problem. On climate change and the environment, we've heard both about the environment that is your personal environment and also climate change. Ultimately, climate change is an existential threat, and I believe this policy moves it forward. On affordable housing, this is not directly benefiting those who make under $100,000, but it is a policy that we should pursue. On process, not perfect. I suspect homeowners and renters may have a different perspective. I think, based on Saturday and what I've been listening to, that there is a majority that supports this. Over the last year in the campaign, I promised to focus on the details, work to build consensus, and listen and engage. I think my votes today on the details show I care about them and ultimately speak for themselves. On consensus, I don't claim that there's a large consensus. I do think that we have listened and tried to reach more of a consensus. Ultimately, I think this will take us forward. Charles and Edward this past weekend reminded me that history is calling with respect to the respective policies that we enact today. We must both move forward because my grandparents and parents benefited from single-family zoning in New Canaan, Connecticut, and Pittsfield, Massachusetts, and the grandparents and parents of many Arlingtonians of color did not. Move forward because if you build a large home on a lot, it is reasonable to be able to build smaller dwellings in the same place. Move forward because our kids and their friends need a better chance to live here. I'll conclude, but I would ask one thing as you leave this room and as people think through the next days, weeks, and months. I hope we can show grace. I hope we can show that it's not about winners and losers, and show grace across generations. Because each of us who is under 40, or in my case, just under 50, hopes to be 60 or 70 or 80 someday. And we have to respect that different generations have different perspectives. Missing middle will not fix all our problems or deliver housing that is affordable to every income level, but it will and is a critical step forward in providing greater access to housing choices that I believe will be more affordable. My vote in favor of moving forward is my strong support for an Arlington that is welcoming in its people, diverse in its communities, and with opportunities for people from any and all walks of life.
Thank you, Mr. DeFerranti. And for the concluding word, Ms. Garvey.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for staying. I mean, a number of you have been with us over it's 18 months or so, 2 years. It's been a long time. Thank you. And I do have thank yous incorporated in my prepared remarks, but I forgot to recognize one important person, which is our chair. I've been doing this kind of work for over a quarter century. I had never had an issue with this many permutations and votes and complexity in one issue. And just thank you, Christian. I really, thank you. I really appreciate it. And you all have been great too. Thank you. I also actually, before I get going, I want to recognize, you mentioned Eric. Thank you, Takis. I've been thinking a lot about Eric Gutschall for the last couple of weeks. I voted yes today because I do firmly believe that we've got to make some changes if we want Arlington to thrive in the future. And because these particular changes, while not perfect or exactly what I wanted, will definitely help move us forward. There's been a lot of passion and upset in this process, and I know many people are convinced that this is going to be terrible for Arlington, and I know many people are convinced it's going to be wonderful for Arlington. Some people on both sides of the issue have not always behaved in the best ways and they've said some unfortunate things, and it's led to a little incivility and some poor or dysfunctional dialogue, but most people have been civil. And I want to say it really has been a privilege to engage with so many people, with our professional staff, who are amazing, and with our public and all of our residents. I mean, I have gotten to know new people I haven't known before. I have reacquainted myself with some friends that I've had for a long time. It really has been a privilege to talk with so many thoughtful people about this really important topic. I've also learned a lot, including about the shameful history of exclusionary zoning and how we got to where we are today. Now, over the past years of all these conversations with dueling experts, dueling research, I've become convinced of a few things. Most importantly, one, no one really knows for sure how this is going to turn out. No one. Number two, we have got to make some changes and move forward, which is why I view what we've adopted today as a pilot. And I have supported a number of guardrails to allow us to try this throughout Arlington, but to mitigate possible harm from unintended consequences. I did not get as many guardrails as I had hoped, but I think we will do all right. We're going to get a lot of helpful information as we monitor what happens. Situations and information will change, and maybe we're going to decide we need to make some adjustments sooner rather than later. Don't worry, staff, not too many. Don't worry, colleagues, but it could happen. And, I always try to remember that every system is set up to get exactly the results it gets. The current single-family zoning system that we've just changed is getting results that are not what I think most of us want. Our current zoning system, in place for almost 100 years, first created a housing market that kept out people of color, and now is causing small houses to be torn down and replaced with single-family mansions all over Arlington. It is now keeping out lots and lots of people. Now, large single-family homes are not bad in and of themselves, but a small county that allows nothing but huge homes for single families over most of its land is, as one speaker put it, not conducive to a sustainable and diverse community. Doing nothing and staying the same, as some have asked, just isn't possible. Change is here, and we see it every day. As one of our speakers put it, I thought quite well, the question is not how to save small single-family homes, but whether they will be replaced by huge single-family homes. Are the changes we adopted today the right changes? Probably not exactly. I don't think I have ever seen something involving people work out just as planned. People just don't work that way. I'm pretty sure we're going to find the need to make some adjustments in the future, maybe the near future, and that's why monitoring and continued engagement will be so important. Is there a better way to have done this process? Probably. But we've tried to do it right with years of study. Another big shout out to our staff, and hours of engaging people to get feedback and then responding to that feedback. Another big shout out to our staff. Lots of work has been done by commissions and residents and everybody here in this room, and I want to thank everyone who has worked and engaged with us in this process. It has not always been pretty, but democracy is messy. And we have been talking about far more than a zoning change. We've been having an important discussion about who we are and what we want our collective future to be. That discussion has long been needed, which is part of the reason it's been so hard. As I've often remarked, when you talk to people, one person can say, I love Arlington, and they're thinking of the real vibrant urban areas that we've got. And another person can say, I love Arlington, and be thinking of our leafy neighborhoods and our big parks. These are two totally different views of what is great about Arlington, and there are a lot of views in between. So I do understand the dismay and the pleas for us to end the division. Many say that we should take more time, start over, and then the conflict and division would end. But it would not. That conflict and division is inherent in who we are, and there is no way to make everyone happy on this issue. Not now. Not by pausing, not by going back and starting over, not by moving forward. We have got some things to work out as a community. Now, when I've talked in the past about a strategic plan or visioning process, I've often been assured that we have a vision statement already, and it is a nice one. I'll just remind everybody, Arlington will be a diverse and inclusive world-class urban community with secure, attractive residential and commercial neighborhoods where people unite to form a caring, learning, participating, sustainable community in which each person is important. I think few people would quarrel with this vision statement. But what this actually means for housing has created a lot of quarrels for the past several years because it means different things to different people. And I'm sure the disagreements about what the vision actually means for housing will not end with this vote. And while I doubt the divisions will ever completely end, I think it really would help if we can find some ways to come together over the next few years to talk about what we want Arlington to look like and be in the future. So while I do regret the upset, I do not regret that we have tackled this issue of how to provide a sufficient supply of housing that meets the needs of every level of the economic ladder and every stage of life. We certainly have not met those needs simply by our action today, but just loosening the grip of one dominant form of housing put in place almost 100 years ago helps. And we've started an important discussion. So moving forward, I do believe it's monitoring and the vision discussion I just mentioned which are most important. So after a break to catch our collective breath, I would like us to work over the next year or so to develop a more specific vision of what we want our neighborhoods and our county to look like and be in the future. And by the time we finish that effort, we should have some real data on how these changes we just made are working out. And then we can see if these changes are taking us where we want to go, or if we should make some adjustments. And I do look forward to that. So everybody take a break. We'll come back together and talk some more. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Garvey. Ms. Jacobs, do we have any other business before the county board?
No, we do not.
Thank you. With that, anybody who's interested can come back in 19 and a half hours. We have a work session on public safety. Invite you all to come, but otherwise, we are adjourned.